What's ruining modern media? Is it the cycle of streaming, where more content is shoveled out and expected to turn out blockbuster results day one, where anything less than that is a failure? Is it studios relying on algorithms and data to bully creatives into producing media designed to appeal to every demographic at once? No, obviously not. According to every big-brained YouTuber I've seen online, the problem is diversity. Media died, of course, as everyone knows, the day that the Ghostbusters became women, the day that the Rise of Skywalker had a single same-sex kiss for like 5 seconds, the day that Buzz Lightyear had a lesbian in it. That was the day all media ended forever. If you've been online for a while, and on online circles as long as I have, you've obviously heard of forced diversity. According to those on the internet who are in the know, of course, it's a content strategy that prioritizes the placements of minorities at the forefront of media. This can take the form of people of color, LGBTQIA people, body positivity, highlighting disabilities, so on, so forth. Essentially, anything that breaks away or runs counter to cishet normative white America is forced, according to a number of critics online.
I want to talk about everyone's favorite topic, blackwashing.
Pushing identity politics and the message. They done woke it up!
I definitely had fun playing a particularly challenging game of Spot the White Guy with this trailer, because damn man, this one shows enough to fulfill Disney's entire DEI quota for the next 2 fiscal years. For example, check out this collection of Jedi Padawans and see if you can identify the one demographic that's mysteriously left out.
And this is terrible because it just is, alright? Take my word for it. It's totally bad that people who are not white are on TV or in the movies. Obviously terrible. Because just take my word for it. It's bad, okay? A lot of people can't explain how this DEI/woke agenda actually is being forced upon us, nor can they explain why it's really a bad thing, at least in any meaningful terminology.
Sorry, did you want to get immersed in our world? Yeah, well, guess what? Pronouns!
Some critics do offer half-hearted explanations, as seen in this clip right here.
And coming back to why it seems as though the studios are blatantly disrespecting the idea of female characters and ethnic minorities is because they overshadow original established characters just to place someone who fits those boxes in that role.
However, as we're going to discuss, these reasons don't really hold much water when you look at what's actually happening in the films themselves. And by distracting, quote-unquote, what they actually mean is something a little more insidious. The big issue seems to be based on replacement theory, the idea that the standard of America is being replaced with something different. But again, that's not inherently a bad thing, even if it were true, which it simply is not. Forced diversity is a phrase that really doesn't mean anything. I mean, after all, how can you validate the idea that something's being forced upon you? Though many people have examples of what they claim to be forced diversity. Whether or not it counts as such remains to be seen, which we'll go over a few. We can't go over everything because, as we see online, every new trailer apparently for every new movie, game, TV show, etc. appears to be a branching arm of this forced diversity agenda, apparently.
And get ready for pronouns in Star Wars.
Oh, no.
So forced diversity, a phrase I don't think really means anything. But the ideas behind why this seems to be pushed so hard, I find fascinating. I think it's important to consider why people are so quick to accept this as a point of view that's legitimate, as well as what this implies about the critics who keep insisting that forced diversity is a problem. Why do we parrot this idea? Undeniably, the modern discourse surrounding forced diversity is far, far older than people realize. It's not just something from when Ghostbusters came out. This is a centuries-old discussion.
My name is Laurence Olivier. In a very short time, it will be my privilege to bring to you one of the great dramatic works of William Shakespeare.
The play Othello focuses on a Moor given station in Roman society. The term Moor was coined by the Europeans and was used in reference to a number of different folks. On paper, however, it referred primarily to the Arabs and the Berbers, but the term also widely was used in reference to inhabitants of North Africa. and even as far east as the people living in South Asia and Sri Lanka. But the core feature? Not white people. So, Othello the Moor, naturally, was played almost exclusively by white people into the mid-20th century. There were exceptions, of course. Ira Aldrich was the first black actor to play Othello in 1825 at London's Docklands, before moving on to larger and bigger productions. You had Paul Robeson, James Earl Jones, Avery Brooks. Lawrence Fishburne was the first black actor to play Othello in a film, and that was in the mid-90s. Yeah, it took that long to get a black person to play a black character. And the person who played Othello before him? Anthony Hopkins.
I pray you, in your letters, when you shall these unlucky deeds relate, speak of me as I am.
Yeah, this may be cringy, but it's a little... I mean, look at Laurence Olivier. He was even worse. Now, what's interesting is if you compare the reactions from critics at the time of these early black performances of Othello, you see very much the same rhetoric you see today when any actor of color is cast in a role traditionally seen as white. Now, of course, you could make the argument this was just decades ago. People were more racist back then. It's different now. Well, is it? Why are we saying the same things? The funny thing is, you notice something if you look back to old reactions versus new reactions. When something is good and widely popular, people stop calling something forced diversity.
If Arnold Schwarzenegger and his pumped-up buddies armed with state-of-the-art weaponry got wiped out almost to the last man by just one of these things, then what kind of a chance has a 100-pound girl with a bow and arrow got against it? But having an actress that's got the size and build of a small child to begin with, trying to realistically fight something of that size isn't going to be cool and unnerving, it's going to be ludicrous. Also, I'd like to point out that no hunter-gatherer society of that time period would have tolerated this kind of bull from one of their own. Those ideas would have been literally beaten out of her before she could say, "Smash the patriarchy."
If the work hasn't come out yet, that means there's a chance it might still be bad. But when a work's come out and it is bad, or is just mediocre, then the person criticizing the trailer was justified in criticizing it. But when it turns out to be good, you often see a half-hearted retraction. The thumbnail titles change, or they release a review saying, well, I was right about this, but the movie's still pretty good in order to placate the audience and hopefully move behind it, maybe to hedge their bets in case public opinion shifts. And they can say they were right the whole time that the diversity and the quote-unquote message of the movie was bad to begin with. But undeniably, this instinct seems to be first instinct. React first, think later. Even when something turns out to be good and beloved, the reaction still remains as proof they reacted first and assessed the media second. For an example of this, take a look at Miles Morales. When he was first announced back in the early 2010s, people were livid. It didn't take long, however, for the comic to come out and the conversation to slowly start to change, though not fast enough. Now, Miles was one of many characters Marvel added over the course of the 2010s. You had characters like Kamala Khan, you had characters like Jane Foster's Thor, who were diverse enough to stand out and be a change from the status quo. And all of them received backlash. But audiences who read comics eased up very quickly because the comics were good. The audiences for both Miles Morales and Kamala Khan grew, especially as the characters explored different avenues of adaptation. Miles Morales appeared in video games, Kamala Khan appeared in video games, animation, live action in the case of Kamala Khan, and the Spider-Verse films in the case of Miles Morales. Massive productions that got a lot of attention on them, and all of a sudden the tune changed around them. While yes, some people argued that Miles Morales isn't really Spider-Man, Peter Parker is, what have you. The majority of people seem to agree Miles Morales and Kamala Khan are pretty solid characters. In fact, it's not uncommon, even among critics of the MCU, especially its most recent phases, to argue that Iman Vellani, who plays Kamala Khan, is one of the highlights of any production she's in, especially the Marvels, which received a ton of critical backlash. Yet she herself received almost no critical backlash. It's interesting how that highlight is now obvious in hindsight. And Captain Marvel, of course, when she came out, was a huge point of contention. The entire Comicsgate movement, which was a right-wing reactionary movement against comic books that started 2016 or so, Captain Marvel was front and center for that, along with a couple other characters. With the MCU now, She-Hulk is a big target for a lot of these reactionaries. But when this big right-wing reactionary movement first started with comic books, the big target was Riri Williams.
My last video on Riri Williams said that she was a, what did I call her? Something like a surly sociopath who seems more of like a villain than a hero.
I want to talk about She-Hulk first, because that's really a curious example, since a lot of the things people are making fun of the She-Hulk show for are things the comics did. Whenever anyone talks about the She-Hulk show, they usually start and end by showing a 3-second clip of She-Hulk twerking with Megan Thee Stallion, as if that's the whole show. That's a summary of the whole thing, right? Some post-credit scene that lasted for a few seconds that the show never comes back to. Well, that's not true, actually. They do show the other scene where Jennifer tells Bruce that she's had experience controlling her anger and reactions to things because she's a woman and she just had to learn these skills naturally, whereas Bruce hasn't had to learn them naturally.
I'm great at controlling my anger. I do it all the time.
People took the scene drastically out of context, framing it as Jen telling Bruce that, Bruce never had any problems, that Bruce never had a struggle, rather than seeing what the scene was saying at face value. That Jen, due to her life experience, just was better equipped at handling anger than Bruce was. Additionally, the scene reinforced that Jen, though she is in better control of her anger, is not as in control as she thinks she is, which would play into the show's finale. Making the scene more interesting is that Bruce might be the only one of the Hulks to be unable to control his anger anyway. Keep in mind, of all the Hulks that appear in the MCU, Bruce is the only one to lose control to his anger. This indicates that the skills Bruce had learned deliberately might have come naturally to everyone else, which reinforces Jen's sentiments even further. What's wild about all this is that these are traits that were already inherent to She-Hulk. She-Hulk could always control her emotions. She-Hulk would always be analyzing and kind of being tongue-in-cheek about sexism in the comic industry, poking fun of it while also embracing it. This is all in line with the She-Hulk character so far. The show just brought that to the forefront, and people took something that was old in the 70s, that they were seeing for the first time in the 2010s or 2020s, I guess, and running with that as though it was some woke agenda thing, even though it's the same stuff during the John Byrne run of She-Hulk. But what's interesting is this. A lot of online criticism about diversity tends to highlight one or two key bits and complain about them while ignoring the rest. They do this in order to insert political theory and extrapolate meaning from a few cherry-picked examples. Beyond that, they don't really care. It doesn't matter. It doesn't fit the agenda, they toss it out. You don't see them go, hey, wasn't it terrible when Daredevil did the walk of shame from She-Hulk's place with a big old grin on his face? Or, oh, She-Hulk addressed the dichotomy of how people see someone with a public persona versus their private persona, as we see when the guys go out with She-Hulk, have a night of fun, and then uncomfortably leave when they see Jennifer come out of the bedroom. They treat her like garbage, but they treat her public persona like a goddess. That dichotomy is very interesting. Heck, if you want to talk about the woke agenda, She-Hulk is one of the first Marvel properties to have a trans actress on screen, and not a single reactionary seemed to notice. That is, except for the pronouns guy, who had this reaction.
And the bride's got a nice rack. That's what I got from this episode.
Just flew over their heads, didn't pick up on it.
And the woman that they actually had playing the girl that was getting married, she's actually trans. And I don't know if people knew that.
She had a nice rack.
I think this is one reason that the Chuds attempting to clown on Agatha all along failed. Because they tried that too. They tried to really clown on the show when it was first coming in preview, saying, oh, it's going to be terrible. Oh, it's gay witches. And then the show came out and they had increasingly less and less to say about it, especially as viewership on the show went up and up and up, despite it being far more overtly queer than any Marvel property at that point, mainly because the show was good. There was so few moments they could poke at and make fun of. They tried making fun of the song sequence from the show, but turned out the song was pretty good, so they kind of quickly realized that wasn't a good avenue to get clicks. They looked, but what are they going to do? And I think this applies, this discussion, that reactionaries highlight a few key bits to ignore all the rest, to create sweeping generalizations about media. That applies especially to Riri Williams. Because, quite frankly, the backlash to Riri Williams was centered entirely on the first couple of comics that introduced her character, and very little else. Though there were attempts, it always fell back to the same select number of moments in that first couple of issues. Undeniably, Riri Williams became the poster child for forced diversity in comics for a while, until we got to the New Warriors, but we'll get to that later. For context, at this time, the big three of the Avengers, that is Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor, they were replaced temporarily with new heroes. Now, all three, of course, would return to their roles eventually, but this gave writers a chance to really experiment with legacy characters inheriting these iconic roles, especially because at this time, the Avengers were really big. Maybe this was a way where they could experiment with to replace the characters in the MCU, which they ultimately did, but I digress. Most iconic, Sam Wilson, Falcon. He took the mantle of Captain America after Captain America's serum started to change. It's a whole comic book thing. What you gotta understand is that Captain America rapidly aged and lost his powers. So, needs to be a new Captain America. Sam Wilson is the man Cap trusts most for the role at that time. Keep in mind, previously, Bucky had inherited the role when Cap died during Civil War, and at this point, Sam was probably like the 15th person to be Captain America. There's John Walker, there's the guy from the 50s, a whole bunch of guys who were Captain America beforehand. So Sam taking the mantle, not as controversial among comic fans. He wasn't the first guy to do it. Slightly more controversial was when Jane Foster took up the mantle of Thor after Thor was deemed unworthy of Mjolnir. Now, fewer people had taken the role of Thor. There were a couple, but Jane Foster becoming Thor, a bit more controversial. And there were a few, shall we say, goofy scenes that reactionaries ate up. They loved to showcase these scenes as a way to show that the whole run was bad, but in hindsight, most people see where the arcs began, continued, and ended as a really good storyline with some really great moments. Unfortunately, and this is admittedly this is true, Riri Williams had a much harder time when she started. Her initial story by Brian Michael Bendis, who also made Miles Morales, it wasn't that good. It just wasn't a very strong story. It didn't leave a strong impression. It felt very, shall we say, like he was trying to do the Miles Morales thing a second time. He was trying to get lightning in a bottle. It just wasn't working quite the same way. The character just wasn't likable at this time. She didn't have a strong sense of identity at this time. She was a teen genius. Okay. There are a lot of teen geniuses in Marvel. What's interesting is, I think, as it went on, later writers took up Riri and made her more interesting, especially when the Champion storyline came around. But it was too little too late to salvage her image to reactionaries. Riri Williams was one of the first characters targeted by Richard C. Meyer, also known as Diversity in Comics, also known as Ya Boy Zach, for reasons I cannot fathom.
Ms. Marvel was introduced as a Pakistani-American Muslim, Riri Williams, who replaced Iron Man. If you don't like her, it's because you're racist or sexist, but probably both.
It would upset a racist.
I think it would. Black is your shield, and woman is your sword.
Meyer would primarily pick up comics of Riri Williams while driving around town and would just go ranting about how this fictional 13-year-old girl was ruining comics.
What are your thoughts on the current state of comic books?
Comics are kind of weirdly dying politics, specifically identity politics being shoved into everything.
I think especially in hindsight, seeing how little impact Riri had on comics puts in perspective at how overblown this whole thing was. Yet Comicsgate, which Meyer kicked off, treated Riri, not Sam and Jane Foster necessarily, but more so Riri, even though those two had a bigger legacy than Riri, as like the figurehead of Marvel, as the single thing to pick apart. And they tried with differing success to target other characters. Captain Marvel being the other one they really tried to target, Carol Danvers, but Riri was their main target for a while. and he'd take a few scenes and take a few segments and go, oh, this start right here, this panel, that proves that Riri is woke and terrible.
But Ironheart, that's a villain's name. And then I start to think about this more because we saw her very, very hero origin, or creepy hero origin. It was just completely sociopathic.
Meyer really wanted to focus on the idea of Riri being a secret villain. That you had to villainize this character to justify her taking the mantle. To justify her role in the story, Riri had to be the big bad, and as he saw it. And he really tried to rewrite the character in fanfiction to be this demonic, insidious figure. To show that by forcing her way into the narrative, she was in fact trying to usurp and ruin the life of Tony Stark. A young black girl ruining the life of a rich old man. Interesting concept, I guess. Kind of speaks to your own biases, I suppose, but what are you going to do? Mind you, it was later revealed in the Champions comics, the team that puts Miles, Kamala Khan, Nova, and a bunch of other characters together, including Riri later on, and Viv, one of the children of Vision. In this comic line, it's revealed that Riri Williams is bisexual, and Comicsgate didn't seem to notice that. I mean, they did mention it, it was brought up, but it didn't really capture the imaginations of the key players in this role, because to them, it wasn't very important. They didn't really care about that. What they cared about was that initial impression, because that was the hardest their narrative hit. They'll say, Miles Morales is Miles Morales, but Peter Parker is Spider-Man. They'll say that too. But that, of course, ignores that Ben Reilly is also Spider-Man, Otto Octavius is also Spider-Man, so on and so forth. They'll say stuff like that with legacy characters. But with Riri Williams, for whatever reason, she was the replacer. She was the one who would usurp the role. She was the reason why legacy characters never work. And it was a very telling situation because it indicated to everyone else around them with brain cells that, hey, these people are just trying to make a big narrative about something that happens in comics all the time. Legacy characters exist constantly. There have been so many Green Lanterns. In fact, one of the key proponents of Comicsgate, Ethan Van Sciver, is partially responsible for the creation of a Green Lantern who happened to be a woman of color. So it seems very hypocritical that he would contribute to this narrative that people of color were replacing white characters when he himself, by his own logic, did that. But again, I digress. While researching for this video, I decided to go on live and watch a few videos from some reactionaries, including Richard Meyer, to see what he had to say about comics. What I found demonstrated that I don't think he knows much about comics at all. Take a listen to what he says about Captain Marvel here.
So they're like, oh, we got female heroes. Well, Captain Marvel, who was Ms. Marvel, she had her own series in the 1970s, and it was very much presented as, hey, look, we have a female hero. That's a big deal. For like decades, she was like a subconscious soul trapped inside of Rogue, who could very, very rarely, communicate with Rogue's regular personality. So Rogue had touched.
Okay, so talking about the Rogue storyline, decades is a strong word there, Richard. Years, yeah, years certainly, but decades, that's a bit much. Yeah, also she was binary back in the 90s, and I think late 80s she became binary for the first time.
Captain Marvel in the 70s and 80s, she had kind of a, I don't know, like, just kind of like a TV, like a Charlie's Angel type of personality. She was kind of like bubbly, she could get strident at times, but she was very much of a girl next door. She went away when her series didn't go that well. She stayed around just because Chris Claremont had some personal affection for her related to his career. And then she came back. And she came back as some weirdly angry, super serious, hyper masculine, humorless character that not only is just a bad character, but doesn't really fit Marvel at all. If you think about it, Marvel...
We're skipping a few years here, Richard. You're forgetting Avengers number 200. You know, the one where Carol Danvers is forcibly impregnated by an alien intelligence and the whole Avengers just don't care about that? And she gets angry at the Avengers for allowing her to be, like, mind-controlled and kidnapped and forcibly impregnated by an alien consciousness. And then, she went to the X-Men to have fun there and was put into a coma, left powerless, and in the desperation of feeling completely meaningless in life, turned to alcoholism to survive. It sounds like you're kind of having a selective memory about this, Richard. Like, yeah, I don't know what happened. Back in the day, she was so happy. And then I just stopped paying attention to her. And when I started paying attention again, like, it's like she was a whole new character. And even going back to the idea that Carol Danvers was Marvel just putting a female superhero in a role, or Riri Williams just them putting a female superhero in a role to replace another male character. This ignores how characters like She-Hulk or Spider-Woman or the original Ms. Marvel herself, Carol Danvers, they were created as female counterparts to the male superheroes. Characters like Black Panther or Jon Stewart, they were created to be black superheroes. They added diversity by the nature of their creation. Stan Lee and the rest of Marvel, from Jack Kirby to Steve Ditko, envisioned Marvel to function as the world outside your window.
We tried to bring comics a little more into the real world. You know, I shouldn't really say this, but the chances are that possibly even you and I aren't perfect. The more realistic we make our characters, the more the college kids who read them think that it's satire, which has taught me a very great lesson. The world is so crazy that if you present things the way they really are, it comes across as broad satire.
If it was just white people, that would not be reflective of the world outside your window. Because if you live in New York City, you know, pretty diverse place.
But I'll tell you one thing you may not have thought of. You know one of the greatest things about Spider-Man's outfit, his costume? What? He is completely covered. So any kid could imagine he's Spider-Man because no color of the skin shows. He could be black under that, he could be red, he could be yellow, he could belong to any race. And that wasn't done purposely, it was done accidentally, but I think it was the best thing we did, making him so that he could be anybody under that costume.
Anyone can wear the mask. You could wear the mask.
People just want to make excuses. So no, I never liked the idea of a tokenized Spider-Man. I always hated that idea. God damn it, create a new character. Is he gonna kill you too? Between him and Nick Fury, they just just try to reskin these characters that already exist. Instead of putting characters through the grinder, they have to piggyback off white characters' legacy. I'm sick of that.
There's a saying you see a lot in these circles. Go woke, go broke, which historically is kind of bizarre. I mean, not just because a lot of these quote-unquote woke properties make a lot of money. I mean, look at Overwatch. Overwatch banked itself on creating a diverse cast of characters, and it made a lot of money. So much money. Recently, Baldur's Gate 3 came out. It featured a very diverse cast. Every character is bisexual in the game. You can do whatever you want in it, within the limits of the confines of the story. And it proved to be one of the best-selling games in recent memory. It won a ton of awards. People love Baldur's Gate 3. And that is basically as diverse as you can get in the recent gaming landscape. Larian didn't go broke making the game, so this argument, this sentiment, it doesn't really make much sense. If the term go woke, go broke is believed to be true, then that means the inverse has to be true as well, right? That if you go as far from woke as possible, you will make tons of money. By that logic. I mean, what else does that mean? What else can we interpret from that? Well, let's examine that for a second. Let's go back to the Comicsgate guys, right? Comicsgate crowdfunded several anti-woke comics, and maybe only a small fraction of them really made a lot. Yeah, sure, a few of them funded their funded enough to pay their artists and get a few thousand issues shipped, but that's about it. The most successful two, of course, as I mentioned before, is Ethan Van Sciver and Eric July, both of whom had some pretty successful campaigns, admittedly. Yet, with Ethan Van Sciver, a lot of his customers complained that the comics were of low quality physically, that the covers were falling apart, that the ink would smudge, that the paper was too brittle and thin to justify the massive price tag for each comic. Eric July seems to have a little more success, but again, neither of these are really blowing up the indie landscape, and several webtoon comics have a far larger readership without the high startup cost you see with these comics. So, again, what are you going to do? If Lore Olympus is beating you, can you really say you were blowing up the comic book world? I don't know. But let's take a look at something outside of comics. Maybe comics is just not the right example. Film. The 2003 film Gods and Generals is regarded as a great example of lost cause propaganda. It's the idea that the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery, which it was, but rather because of the freedom against the tyranny of the Union to stop them from having slaves. The film stars Stephen Lang, Robert Duvall, Jeff Daniels, and against a $56 million budget, it grossed $12 million. $12,800,000 to be exact. It was a massive flop. When Gina Carano left The Mandalorian following some deeply offensive comments about trans people and pissing off Pedro Pascal repeatedly, she decided to follow up her success in Star Wars by working with the Daily Wire on films that all bombed horribly because no one cared about them. They either had a limited theatrical release or went straight to streaming on the Daily Wire's platform, where even on the Daily Wire, it didn't really catch fire. Compare the films that she was in to the success of Mr. Bircham.
Look this show up on practically any online platform that supports images, and you'll see lavish fan art of Carponzi old dick here sucking face. Search for Bircham discussion in text, and you'll see people talking about this show like it's X-rated Heartstopper. The foursome between these four would go crazy. Mr. Bircham's gay daughter respects her dad so much. I want to draw Mr. Bircham pregnant, and that one gay teacher holding his belly, smiling at each other, and so on.
No one cared what she did after Star Wars. No one gave a crap. Mr. Bircham, however, was at least memeable. Most of the Daily Wire's content from there, however, just didn't capture the vibe, or at least the interest of audiences, outside of maybe a hyper niche audience. Now, of course, all types of films have succeeded and failed over history. I could look at each financially successful woke film, quote unquote, and compare it to each flop conservative film. I could do that very easily, but that would be a waste of everyone's time. If you want to look at numbers, just look at Box Office Mojo, or whatever box office site we're using right now. But let's take a simple example. Ghostbusters 2016, the one with all the women in it. That flopped, right? That did terribly, obviously. The internet told me it did terribly, so let's take a look at the numbers. Why did it flop? Well, the film cost $144 million to reboot a $30 million comedy. The original Ghostbusters was only $30 million. 2016, $144 million. And they learned their lesson, because Ghostbusters Afterlife, that only cost $75 million. That's much less. So by that nature, even if it earned less, Ghostbusters Afterlife would not be a flop like the previous film was. Cost less to make, more of a profit margin. So how much did each film make? Ghostbusters Afterlife, that grossed $204.3 million. Against $75 million budget, that's fantastic. That's compared to Ghostbusters 2016, which grossed, $229 million. That's more than what Afterlife grossed. So wait, the film that flopped grossed much more than the film that didn't flop. Again, it's all because of budget, yes, but that means that more people still went to see the female Ghostbusters film than the superior follow-up. Sounds strange, doesn't it, when you think like that? I don't hate Ghostbusters 2016, though I don't like it all that much. And not because it has women in it, but because I find it offensive that Harold Ramis spent decades trying to get a third Ghostbusters film made, and Bill Murray kept them from making it, only for the moment after he passed for them to greenlight a new Ghostbusters film. I find that morally reprehensible. I just can't support the film for that reason. Or really any Ghostbusters films to follow the passing of Harold Ramis. But again, yes, Ghostbusters 2016 did not do well financially, but it still grossed more than the follow-up Ghostbusters films, even though they're supposedly better. The moral is don't spend too much money on your blockbuster for a comedy sequel, but again, that still means that people were interested in the reboot, more interested than the later films. Interesting how that works out, isn't it? But again, go broke, right? Yeah. Let's go back further, way further. Studios were absolutely marketing films entirely for minority audiences back in the day. Look at the Blaxploitation craze of the 70s. Films made primarily by a few white studios, entirely for black audiences. And while a couple of these films are good despite all the production issues, these films were made cheap and quickly to cash in on what they saw as a craze. Yet the ones that were made by black directors and black actors and black writers tended to be better because the artists were able to be more sincere with their storytelling. Hi, this is me editing the video. I realized I left out a ton of history about blaxploitation in this segment, so I wanted to fill it in very quickly. Now obviously, they are films starring black actors that predate the blaxploitation movement, but a few factors really led to the studios really making an abundance of films about black characters. Now, of course, there were several Oscar bait films like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and all that, but the big initiatives, I think, are Night of the Living Dead, which was the George Romero film that starred Dwayne Jones, and the movie Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, an independent film made by Melvin Van Peebles. Now, Melvin Van Peebles, he wrote the film, produced the film, starred in the film, edited the film, did all the music along with Earth, Wind, and Fire. No studio would finance this movie. Not a single one wanted to put money into it because of how controversial it is. There were several, shall we say, erotic scenes that were apparently real, not fake, but authentic, actual on screen. The only person who offered money, bizarrely, in hindsight, is Bill Cosby, who offered $50,000 for the film, against a budget of $150,000, again, 1/3 of which belonged to Bill Cosby. The movie grossed $15.2 million. And keep in mind, this is 70s money. It was released in Detroit originally in 1971, and from there sparked a movement. Studios took notice of this. Now, Hollywood's response was essentially Shaft. Shaft was directed by Gordon Parks. It's an iconic blaxploitation crime film. I think one of the best depictions of New York City in the 70s. Like, those shots of New York City are just beautiful. The film was more of a mainstream hit. That was released by MGM. It was a much more mainstream film, and that film's success and aesthetic and style became what we now see as blaxploitation. Now, both of these movies were made by black directors, but Shaft was produced by white producers. And that's a key difference because from there, white producers began funding blaxploitation films for black audiences. Take Blackula, for example, which I think is a great horror film from the 70s.
Blackula, the Black Avenger.
It was directed by William Crane, who is a black man, and was produced by American International Pictures, with Crane and star William Marshall getting undercut repeatedly by the producers. Marshall had to fight for the creative control and freedom to ensure his character came across as a dignified prince. Prince Mamuwalde ends up being turned into a vampire by Dracula after the prince thinks he can maybe convince Dracula to help him stop the transatlantic slave trade. Dracula laughs at this idea and then turns the prince into a vampire and steals his girl.
Curse you with my name. You shall be Blackula.
He calls him Blackula to humiliate him. Blackula was presented as almost a Shakespearean character, one with dignity, with weight behind his words, a tragic figure.
And now for something completely different.
I think the movie Dolomite, despite it being a target of derision in many circles, is honestly a small miracle. The film was made on next to nothing and was a hit. A small hit, but a hit nonetheless. This is despite the extremely low budget for the entire affair. It started off as an adaptation of Rudy Ray Moore's comedic routines. He did these rhymed poetic toasts, and Moore did this one about a folk hero named Dolomite, turned it into a movie, the rest is history. He got his own comedy routines recorded before this, and using that, the success of his comedy routines that were on records, he funded the entire production of Dolomite on his own. He cast his friends, he cast everyone. He hired a director to direct the film, he did everything himself that he could, and the rest he paid people to do in the black community. By all accounts, Dolomite is not a well-made film. It is sloppy. The boom mic shows up in half the scenes. The effects are unconvincing. Rudy Ray Moore is no martial artist, despite him doing all these karate scenes on screen. But it's one of the few films of the 70s made by black people, for black people, from top to bottom. Now that is forced diversity. That is a man forcing his vision into the world that would not want it there to begin with, but my God, it got there nonetheless, and it found its audience. That is worth celebrating. That is an accomplishment in cinema. That is what we talk about when we say something is forced, and forced to create something fantastic and amazing in the process. Studios capitalizing on a craze, that's not forced. Forcing studios to create something good while capitalizing on a craze, that is forced. So the idea that any studio creates something that's forced, it's ridiculous. The only force is from the creatives trying to push it to be a quality production.
That's for fucking with me, you no business born insecure motherfuckers!
Now, of course, there are many writers out there who try to create worlds that push against the white-centric and heteronormative society that the works are written in. For example, Ursula K. Le Guin. Yeah, I get to talk about what's in the books behind me for once. Isn't that cool? It's not just random set decoration. It's a choice.
I had written a couple of short stories that took place on these islands where there were wizards and dragons.
Ursula K. Le Guin famously started writing the Earthsea series to kind of move against trends that she had spotted in fantasy. For example, very obviously, Earthsea is an archipelago. It's not a big landmass, not a continent, it's not basically Britain, it's an archipelago of islands. But also, most of the characters in Earthsea are not white. Earthsea is written from the perspective of a young wizard who grows up and matures. This was kind of deconstructing the idea that the heroes of fantasy have to be young, plucky swordsmen and not the grand old wizards like Gandalf or whoever. But Le Guin also was pushing back against the idea that only white people could exist in fantasy. Le Guin was a progressive even back then, though she would later go even further beyond and reevaluate her own works from a modern lens, but I'll get to that in a second. Earthsea's population is primarily consistent of brown, black, and red-skinned individuals. Now, there is a population of white characters who are basically savages who raid island to island and worship a god of evil. Years later, after the initial 3 books in the Earthsea series, Le Guin would reevaluate her work and find that from a feminist perspective, the works hadn't aged as well as she would have preferred. So she created the book Tehanu. Tehanu deconstructs the society she already built in Earthsea decades prior to reevaluate how the patriarchal society at that time controls and manipulates the actions of women and kind of suppresses their accomplishments and actively hurts them in the process. It's a very biting book. And from there on, Earthsea became a deconstruction of Earthsea itself. Even the idea of the afterlife in Earthsea becomes part of society's attempt to control the masses. It's quite interesting and quite compelling. And again, Earthsea is easy to read. The whole volume is like on my shelf right there. It's like one volume if you get the whole collected issue, and it's a nice beautiful hardcover book, and it's got some nice illustrations. All the books are there. It's fantastic. I love Earthsea. Ursula K. Le Guin would also write, again, my set dressing is actually part of the video this time, The Left Hand of Darkness. The Left Hand of Darkness is a sci-fi novel that back in the 60s deconstructed gender and gender identity in a way where an alien race kind of exists where they change genders organically. And how does that affect their perspective of gender? How does that affect other creatures' perspective of their gender? How does that culture shock impact people? And she was really playing with ideas that I think over time have only become more relevant and more important to the audiences who read and consume them. It's one of the reasons why Ursula K. Le Guin is my favorite sci-fi fantasy writers. She didn't write long books, but the books that she wrote had a lot of impact, and she knew exactly what to say at any given time. It's a very big shame we lost her fairly recently. Now, one thing that's interesting about Earthsea specifically is how it was adapted twice. Earthsea was once adapted by the Sci-Fi Channel following Lord of the Rings and all that, and later on by Goro Miyazaki, the son of Hayao Miyazaki, for Studio Ghibli. It's very interesting then that when Sci-Fi, the American company, adapted Earthsea, they changed all the characters to white, except for the one mentor character who's played by Danny Glover. Beyond that, it's all white people, and a lot of the conflict is softened. A lot of the darker elements are gone. I mentioned the cult before that worships a god of evil. In the sci-fi version, they just turned into like a basic nunnery. It's very vanilla, it's very whitewashed in many ways. Now, the Ghibli film also has a similar problem. Ursula K. Le Guin at the time was kind of disappointed that the characters weren't darker skinned or more explicitly from other cultures. That might be chalked down to a culture shock, because in Japan, they kind of view these characters as what darker skinned people would look like. At least that's what Goro Miyazaki said. Hayao Miyazaki famously was disappointed in the film when it came out.
My purpose in making most of the people of Earthsea colored and the whites a marginal and rather backwards people was of course a moral one aimed at young American and European readers. Fantasy heroes of the European tradition were conventionally white, just about universally so in 1968, and darkness of skin was often associated with evil. By simply subverting an expectation, a novelist can undermine a prejudice. The makers of the American TV version, while boasting that they were colorblind, reduced the colored population of Earthsea to 1.5. I have blasted them for whitewashing Earthsea, and do not forgive them for it. The issue is different in Japan. I cannot address the issue of race in Japan because I know too little about it. But I know that an anime film runs smack into the almost immutable conventions of its genre. Most of the people in anime films look, to the American-European eye, white. I am told that the Japanese audience perceives them differently. I am told that they may perceive this Ged as darker than my eye does. I hope so. Most of the characters look white to me, but there is at least a nice variation of tans and beiges. And Tanar's fair hair and blue eyes are right, since she's a minority type from the Kargish Islands.
Though interestingly enough, the Ghibli film did adapt elements of Tehanu, but kind of ironed off the deconstructionist elements from it. I think this is less to do with any overt bigotry, but more to do with Goro Miyazaki's inexperience as a director and Ghibli production kind of rushing the film through. I think that the Ghibli film had potential to really exaggerate, but again, both adaptations force not diversity, but force conformity. They force a certain visual aesthetic, a certain racial aesthetic, and while the Ghibli film is the superior adaptation, I'd be hard-pressed to say we have ever gotten a really good adaptation in live action or in animation of the Earthsea novels. As for other authors that have very strong intentionality of representing people in their work, look at Percy Jackson.
I decided to make Percy Jackson ADHD and dyslexic because my own son is ADHD dyslexic, and he was having a lot of trouble when he was young learning how to read. He really didn't like school, really didn't like English class, and as an English teacher myself, that was pretty hard for me to take. So I used Greek mythology as a way to keep him interested in school. I would tell him stories, and when I ran out, he asked me to make up a new myth for him, and that became Percy Jackson. I decided that Percy should be like him, an ADHD dyslexic kid, having his own trouble, but I made it a sign of honor. If you had those conditions, there was a good chance you were a demigod. And my son had no trouble believing that.
Rick Riordan wanted to create a novel for his son, who was dyslexic. I think he had ADHD as well, and he found there were very few stories that centered on kids with developmental disabilities, with any kind of invisible disability at all. And so he created a world of diverse characters to allow kids to feel seen in the works they read. And what's great about Rick Riordan's work is that whenever he encountered a kid who didn't feel seen in the world, he would make a character just for that type of kid. Whatever the case may be, because he just felt that strongly about making sure kids were seen in their story and felt like the heroes who could save the day or bring change to the world, even if they were the bad guys even, you know? What's interestingly enough is that other works at the time kind of had a hands-off perspective. They wouldn't say the ethnicities of characters, like say J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter. Yeah, I know you said that Hermione could have been black in the books. You never said otherwise, except you kind of did. But that's kind of strange, though, isn't it, JK, that you'd have the possibly black female lead of the book fight for the revolution for a slave race, and then have every character gaslight her to say, oh no, they want to be slaves. They're happy. Yeah, I didn't forget about Spew. Think I forgot about Spew, JK? I don't think I forgot about Spew. A lot of mainstream audiences forgot about Spew because the filmmakers wisely didn't adapt it into their films, but I never forgot. I remember. And how when the only house elf to be freed other than Dobby gets freed, they become a depressed alcoholic because they're not a slave. Yeah, I remember that. I recall that. Or how Dobby's seen as a freak for asking for wages. Yeah, I remember that. I remember that, JK. I recall that quite explicitly. Anyway, there are many writers out there who push against convention and create more and more diverse works of fiction. Another example would be the YA boom in the 2010s. There were books such as, and I'm going to point again to my bookshelf, Six of Crows.
I think it's extraordinary to create books that are both mirrors and windows for kids, and I've seen this play out again and again.
Six of Crows features a very diverse cast of characters. The book is basically Be Gay, Do Crimes, the novel. But with Kaz specifically, Kaz Brecker, the main character of Six of Crows, he's experienced a disability very similar to the author, Leigh Bardugo. They both require a cane. They both have difficulty walking, and Leigh Bardugo lifted from her own life experience when writing Kaz.
I have a disability. I have a degenerative bone disease. I deal with chronic pain. And I didn't actually realize when I was writing Kaz Brecker that I was writing my own experience into the book. Now, Kaz gets his injury by falling off the roof of a bank during a heist, which is not how I came by mine. But I didn't realize until I was done with that first draft, which just goes to show how self-involved writers are, that I was really writing the kind of strength I wanted to see in him and me.
And I think that's very interesting. I think it's very compelling to draw from what you know. And what's very important is that Kaz Brecker, despite needing a cane and having trouble walking, is still a complete badass who can take on anyone in a fight, mainly using his cane as a weapon and the people's impression of him as a weapon against them. Also, he is definitely has some OCD. He can't touch anything that's decaying or gross, so I hear you there. Six of Crows is great. Again, I feel like I've mentioned it a few times in my videos. Six of Crows is fantastic. The Hate U Give, another great young adult book focusing on police brutality. It was one of the top-selling YA books of the 2010s. It was on the bestseller list for like actual years straight.
This question of appearance versus reality recurs throughout The Hate U Give. Star, familiar with perceptions of her neighborhood, community, and herself, code switches to adapt to her environment and others' expectations. After the shooting, a new narrative, one that paints Khalil as a drug dealer threatening a cop, surfaces, but an emboldened Star challenges this simplistic framing of her friend. The novel goes on to raise cogent and credible counter-arguments to the flattening narratives often presented by authorities and echoed by many media outlets in shooting cases involving young black males.
The film itself, I think, is not as well received as the book, but it's a pretty solid work. I also think it's interesting that the Hate U Give film stars Amanda Stenberg, who would later go on to work in The Acolyte and draw a lot of controversy therein because of their race. I really want to get into a specific book. I can get sidetracked for hours on other books that feature diversity very deliberately, but the book I really want to talk about right now is the book that's been on my shelf and might have caught your eye to begin with, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Chinua Achebe was a writer and a scholar who had a lot of thoughts about Conrad's 1899 novella Hearts of Darkness. The book depicts a steamboat captain named Charles Marlowe, who goes down the Congo River, encountering an ivory trader named Kurtz. Kurtz saw himself initially as a figure of rationality and civility coming to the Dark Continent, but he's been driven mad by his experiences, concluding that the only solution to Africa would be to eradicate the population of Africa. Now, I must point out that when Kurtz says he wants to fix Africa, it's seen as a complete positive, because this was written in the era of Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden, where it was seen as a noble cause to go down to Africa and try to bring British or French or whatever civilization, European civilization, white civilization, to what they perceived to be a savage, chaotic monstrosity.
When I had been younger, I had read these adventure books about the good white man, wandering into the jungle, on the danger and the savages were after him. And I would instinctively be on the side of the white man, the good white man. You see, this is what fiction can do. It can put you on the wrong side if you are not developed enough. In the university, I certainly saw that these books had to be read in a different light. Reading The Heart of Darkness, for instance, which was a very, very highly praised book, and it is still very highly praised in American universities.
In the West.
I realized that I was one of those savages jumping up and down on the beach. I was not on Marlowe's steamer, you see, as I had thought before. And once that kind of enlightenment comes to you, you realize that you need to write a different story, that someone has to write a different story.
And in response, aside from academic speeches and lectures, Achebe wrote the 1958 novel Things Fall Apart. The story focuses on Okonkwo. Okonkwo is part of a tribe in Igboland, which is now modern southeast Nigeria. It starts with him being a hero, but there's a tragic fall. It shows Okonkwo being this great leader who, through his own actions and personal pride, starts to fall in society. On its own, Okonkwo's story would already be a very interesting and compelling narrative, but adding to it is that how halfway through the narrative, the colonists interrupt everything and derail civilization. His people conform to their ways. The society he was raised in, that he embodies, is demolished. The book ends with Okonkwo taking himself away from the equation after he comes back to his village and finds the society that he defended and he believed in is now completely gone. His village has abandoned their culture in the face of colonial influence. And the book ends with one of the colonizers musing how Okonkwo's fate will make for a fun little part in his book titled The Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of Lower. In other words, it becomes part of the text that inspired Hearts of Darkness. I don't think I need to explain what work between Hearts of Darkness and Things Fall Apart I personally feel is the more profound. But let's discuss it. Conrad excluded African people from his narrative about colonialism, to the point where the colonized have no real role. White people are given names and rank and personality. The citizens of the Dark Continent are treated like a horde. They're treated like background chattering. You could replace all the cast of all the black characters from Hearts of Darkness with leopards, and nothing would change at all. Of course, as bad as Hearts of Darkness was at depicting Africa, at least it was framed that Kurtz was the villain. Kurtz was bad for wanting to exterminate them. This is completely unlike works like Birth of a Nation or Ingagi, popular films from the 1910s, 20s, and 30s that spread extremely racist statements by people of color. Birth of a Nation, of course, is famous for bringing back the Klan into popular culture. Woodrow Wilson described it as history being written by lightning. And of course, the film inspired a massive resurgence of racist groups that we're still seeing have an impact in politics to this very day. Whereas Ingagi, which is lesser known, spread the idea that black people and apes could interbreed. This extremely racist film, excessively racist, led to a popularization of ape cinema in Hollywood for that time, for several years later. When it came time to greenlight King Kong, the producers looked at Ingagi and said, well, that movie made money. I guess audiences like apes. Let's make more apes on screen. Thankfully, King Kong, though there are academic discussions about its implications and its work as an allegory, is not as overtly racist by any means as Ingagi. And I think that people really need to get perspective on that, because Ingagi is like couple years before King Kong, and it's like, that's not subtext. They're actually just saying the extremely racist conspiracy theories out loud. If there's any good thing about Ingagi, it's Son of Ingagi. No, it's not a sequel. It's a film made in 1940 by Richard C. Kahn. It's written by Spencer Williams, based on his own short story, House of Horror, and, remarkably enough, it is the first horror sci-fi film to feature an all-black cast. In 1940, this is right after Gone with the Wind, this was a major milestone in cinema, and honestly a pretty good movie that pokes fun and parodies some elements that Ingagi popularized. It's one of the first cases of diversity being used in film to counter a white normalizing narrative. It's just a testament to how incredible works can be when working against the systems of power established by the Hollywood system, established by society. It's worth revisiting, and it's pretty silly at times too, for its time. I mean, elements of it have dated, but hey, this was revolutionary for its day and unfortunately underwatched in its era. Now, there's probably a few responses at this point that I want to address. I mean, I'm sure I've been going on for a while, so it's going to be a few people saying, oh, what about this? What about that? Let's talk about some of those responses. Now, one concept you see mentioned from time to time is tokenism. Tokenism is a very specific term, and it's different from forced diversity. The token minority character is a singular character who exists to fill a niche. They have a specific goal that the creatives want to accomplish, and they're put in. They represent a demographic, but they're the only ones there, and they're usually on the periphery of the story. They're not a major role in the narrative. The token black friend, for example, is a great example of this. A friend who exists mainly for the main character to bounce ideas off of, and they don't really contribute much to the plot. They just sort of exist there. They may get killed off by the villain to add emotional impact to the hero, but beyond that, all their goal is just to exist as a black person and as a friend. There's the character that Cassie Lemons, who would later direct the incredible movie Eve's Bayou, and furthermore the movie Harriet. The character she plays in Candyman. She's the friend of Helen. She kind of goes around with Helen to Cabrini Green. She talks to Helen. They discuss the issues at play, and then she gets killed by Candyman halfway through the movie. Spoiler alert. Dave Chappelle's character in the movie You Got Mail. In that, he's Tom Hanks' best friend. And they basically both are opening up a business together. They're part of like a big, totally not Barnes & Noble chain of stores. They discuss Tom Hanks' love life. And halfway through the movie, Dave Chappelle just leaves the movie. He fulfills his quota, then goes. At least with Candyman, she's not the only black character. There are many black characters in Candyman. In fact, there's more black characters in Candyman than there are white characters in Candyman. And they all have different perspectives. There's a big difference between the character Anne-Marie, who lives in Cabrini Green, is trying to raise her son in the projects, and is afraid of both the gangs and the possible supernatural influences of Candyman. There's a big difference between Anne-Marie and Bernadette, the character who I'm implying is the token black best friend. Bernadette also has a lot of moments in Candyman where she directly contradicts Helen's perspectives. Not just simply a platform for Helen to bounce ideas off of, but she directly challenges Helen. She is a stage of resistance. And in the narrative, yes, she does die. She gets killed by Candyman. It's not a very well fleshed out character, but there is still groundwork for the character that I think makes them a step above, say, Dave Chappelle's character, who literally exists just for Tom Hanks to talk about his love life. There's no value to his character, and quite frankly, the moment he fulfills his quota, he's gone from the movie. I mean, both movies are good, but you can definitely see the trope in play in You Got Mail, whereas Candyman employs the idea of the trope, but tries to layer it and tries to avoid it. And while it still falls back on some traps, you can at least see they were trying. But what about works that just use bad representation? Well, is that still forced? I'd say no. Bad representation is not the same as forced representation. Further, saying something is forced or bad or tokenizing can sometimes be an easy dismissal without really diving into why something is bad or forced or not good.
They didn't know until Into the Spider-Verse came. The normies certainly didn't. So now people use him loosely. He's becoming people's favorite Spider-Man. They throw the tokenism bone, they throw the shit, and there you have it.
As we mentioned before, a lot of these criticisms start in the trailer phase. We're not really even watching the movie or playing the game. And a great example of that is when people try to point to things that they believe to be historically inaccurate. Shows like Bridgerton do have a colorblind casting choice. This same principle applies to Kenneth Branagh's Shakespeare adaptations. A lot of Shakespeare adaptations that Kenneth Branagh did employed a colorblind casting choice. And in some cases this gets a little weird, like having Denzel Washington and Keanu Reeves being brothers. It ultimately adds to the fantasy feel of his Shakespeare adaptations. And while a lot of people complained about Ariel being black in the live-action Little Mermaid, I have a weird time imagining them watching the 1990s Cinderella, where the entire cast is diverse. That might be the best version of Cinderella, next to Ever After, by the way. I do love how the 90s had some of the best Cinderella movies, and just afterwards we just lost the plot, and beforehand we just had no idea what the plot was. Just saying. So, yeah, diversity exists in media. Whether or not it's good depends on how well-rounded the characters are in the plot and how they exist in the plot. Are they just there to fill a quota, or do they exist as characters? Keep in mind this, that's still not forced tokenism. It's not forced in the plot. They do usually exist as a periphery, but you could take them and leave them, and the plot still remains the same. When I hear forced, I usually think, oh, it's shoved in and they're pushing some other element out. Well, what are they pushing out with tokenism? It's bad, but it's not quite the same thing as forced. But it's bad for a different reason, for a complex reason you have to explain. Undeniably, one of the worst examples of modern representation in media would be the New Warriors. The New Warriors were a set of superheroes made for Marvel Comics meant to fulfill very token quotas. They were embodiments of certain stereotypes and cliches and tropes surrounding minorities. No one liked these guys. Not a single person.
And yesterday, Marvel Comics made history by announcing something that nobody in the world liked. They announced the New Warriors comic series, which was received with overwhelming sighs and just a thunderous amount of disinterest.
And I don't know about you, but I can't imagine anyone better equipped to take on the responsibility of keeping the world safe than these tough, seasoned, dangerous, and, diverse individuals. Truly, this comic has got success written all over it.
I cannot defend this one, at all.
They were awful, and thankfully, Marvel, in their wisdom, canceled the comic before it even came out. This was an idea so terrible, not a single human being liked it. It wasn't forced, necessarily. It was just horrendously written, which is a very different problem than forced. But I want to focus on one component especially, the idea of historical inaccuracy in representing black people, people of color, the LGBTQA population.
Trans ideology is everywhere these days. It's taken over the police, the health service, and even schools. We talk about it constantly, but the finer points of this ideology and its history are still not widely understood. Many of them can even be traced back to one man and a sick medical experiment that he conducted.
One thing I see a lot of people referencing are the studies of John Money, who back in the 50s and 60s did a lot of studies on gender identity, and a lot of people who are against trans people will cite the Money studies as being the origin point of trans identity. That there's no trans people for the John Money studies, but
Dr. John Money was a New Zealand-born sexologist and pioneer in the field of sexuality and gender. In 1955, he was the first person to use the word gender to draw a distinction between biological sex and what we now call gender identity. In fact, you can thank Money for giving us the term gender identity. He opened the world's first gender identity clinic in Baltimore in 1966, and he popularized the ideas that are central to today's trans movement, particularly the deranging notion that our biological sex doesn't necessarily determine whether we are male or female.
Amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
But people forget that prior to the John Money studies, the Christine Jorgensen reassignment surgery had already taken place.
A 26-year-old ex-GI arrives home from Denmark where doctors converted him into a woman. 2 years ago, the name was George Jorgensen. Today, it's Christine.
So not only did the John Money studies take place after doctors already knew how to do gender reassignment, it also took place after one of the most highly publicized transitions in American history. This was on on TV, this was on the radio, it was on newspapers, and it was celebrated. Now that being said as well, this also ignores the fact that under a certain German fascist leader, many clinics that were studying gender and orientation were shuttered and destroyed.
Not everyone arrested under paragraph 175 identified as a man.
During the German Empire and the Weimar Republic, Germany was home to a developing community of people who identified as transvestites. Magnus Hirschfeld, a German physician and sexologist, coined the term transvestite in 1910. Initially, this term encompassed people who performed in drag, people who cross-dressed for pleasure, as well as those who today might identify as trans or transgender. While today, in English, the term transvestite is outdated and offensive, it was widely used at the time. Some self-identified transvestites were arrested under paragraph 175.
This became a big topic when another person we mentioned before, J.K. Rowling, tried to publicly deny this happened, when in reality, no, these clinics existed and these clinics were shut down by the Nazis. This was a thing that happened. You really can't ignore history, but you can publicly deny it ever occurred, and people will believe you if you shout it loud enough. Just like if you shout that John Money created this whole movement, well, I'm sure if you never did any more homework on the topic, you would believe that. Oh, and I'm sure you'd be surprised to hear this too. John Money wasn't even on the cutting edge of gender identity studies in America at this time either.
The misattribution of gender identity to money is quite common. In his bestseller, As Nature Made Him, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Girl, Colin Pino writes, 15 years after joining Johns Hopkins, Money was already widely credited as the man who coined the term gender identity to describe a person's inner sense of himself or herself as male or female. Other examples include the entry John Money in the Encyclopedia of New Zealand and Money's obituary in the New York Times. As Haig notes, gender identity first appeared in 1963 in papers given by the UCLA psychiatrist Robert Stoller and Ralph Greenson at the 23rd International Psychoanalytical Congress in Stockholm. Gender identity is the sense of knowing to which sex one belongs. That is, the awareness, I am a male or I am a female. The term gender identity was arrived at in joint discussions of a research project on this and allied problems by Greenson and Stoller, during which many of the formulations in this paper were worked out. Gender identity refers to one's sense of being a member of a particular sex. It is expressed clinically in the awareness of being a man or a male in distinction to being a woman or a female. The term was formulated in collaboration with Stoller, whose presentation deals with another aspect of this subject.
This, of course, ignores the fact that this only discusses how in the 20th century our modern understanding of gender became a thing. Back in the 30s, they believed that homosexuality was someone becoming a third gender. That was a common belief. The third gender was homosexuality, which is wild to think about. And not to mention the fact that there were Roman emperors who tried to commission physicians to find a way to turn a man into a woman. This is another thing that happened historically. And these are only the accounts that we have, because poorer people, less populated areas, their material and their record keeping was lost to time. Oh, and of course, not even getting into homosexuality, because in many countries that are widely homophobic, these ideas were not instilled in them until much, much later. Japan, for example, did not have an anti-LGBTQA law, anti-gay laws, anti-fraternizing with two men laws, until the Meiji Restoration, when Japan tried to be more like the West. Prior to that, there's no record of any law existing outlawing the practice of buggery or sodomy or anything like that. It was simply speaking just when Japan tried to be more like Europe that these laws were instilled. Because beforehand, not only was it common practice, it was commonly written in literature at the time.
Genji alone lay plunged in the blackest melancholy. But even while he was raging at the inhuman stubbornness of her newfound and incomprehensible resolve, he found that he could not but admire her the more for this invincible tenacity. At last, he grew tired of lying awake. There was no more to be done. A moment later, he had changed his mind again, and suddenly whispered to the boy, "Take me to where she is hiding." "It is too difficult," he said. "She is locked in, and there are so many people there. I am afraid to go with you." "So be it," said Genji. "But you, at least, must not abandon me." and he laid the boy beside him on his bed. He was well content to find himself lying by this handsome young prince's side, and Genji, we must record, found the boy no bad substitute for his ungracious sister. Ho ho ho, damn! Genji a hoe! He a hoe! Oh, beautiful. 10 out of 10. This is like trashy reality TV drama, and I am here for it.
That was seen as commonplace. But if I talk about anything with historical inaccuracy right now, it's Assassin's Creed Shadows I want to highlight. Assassin's Creed Shadows is a now upcoming entry in the sprawling Assassin's Creed saga. It's a series that has been well regarded in some circles for some of its historical accuracy, though not consistently. Basically, you jump to a point of history, you're an assassin, you're wrecking house, doing the job, taking people down, different eras, different points, what have you. Shadows takes place in Japan during the Azuchi Monoyama period, the final phase of the Sengoku period that ran from 1558 to 1600. It's most well known for the reign of Daimyo Oda Nobunaga and his successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and their conflicts with several warlords, most notably Takeda Shingen. This conflict would eventually lead to the unification of Japan's provinces under a single central government. It was the end of the Warring States period. One figure that has always drawn interest from historians, both inside and outside of Japan, was one of Nobunaga's most loyal retainers, Yasuke. Many refer to him as the only black samurai in Japanese history. There are very few documents that discuss Yasuke. We know Yasuke was brought over by Jesuit priests. Nobunaga, who had never seen a black man before, summoned Yasuke to his court. Nobunaga was so impressed with Yasuke's physical power that he decided to appoint Yasuke as one of his retainers, meaning he could bear a sword, he had a house, and was given a salary. So overnight, Yasuke went from a slave to a man with station and authority under a daimyo. Now, at this time, a retainer basically was a samurai. Now, sadly, Nobunaga was defeated shortly thereafter, which meant Yasuke was returned to the Jesuits, and that's the end of Yasuke's story in history. It's a very brief account of about a year or two where Yasuke is referenced, is discussed, but that led to people's imaginations being captured. A black samurai, that's incredible. A foreigner brought over, Nobunaga recruiting someone outside of Japan to fight alongside him. A man who didn't just recognize the power of his own people, but the power of those outside of his population, respecting the strength therein. Assassin's Creed Shadow is not the first nor the last piece of media that's showcased Yasuke. He's shown up in books, anime, games, the like. I thought, when they announced he'd be a character in this game that you could play as, yeah, it made sense. Everyone knows Yasuke. Apparently I was wrong. Apparently I was really wrong, because everyone online started saying Yasuke was an example of forced diversity. A lot of pseudo-historical experts, including several white people pretending to be actually Japanese people, came forward to insist that no, Yasuke was never a samurai. In fact, all he ever did was just hold Oda Nobunaga's swords into battle. And really, there were no records of Yasuke actually fighting, according to them. So really, a retainers, that's basically a word for slave. So Yasuke went from one slave master in the Jesuits and then went to a new slave master with Nobunaga. Because Nobunaga would never just get a good fighter to fight with him in a time period where he needed all the fighters he could get, right? And because of that, a narrative began to form, one that ignored the history. Japanese historians also said Yasuke, as a retainer, is a samurai. Retainers had positions of high power in this period of time. If you were given a household, if you were given the right to bear a sword, you were an authority. At one point online, a painting was spreading around, and this depicted what some people were claiming was Yasuke holding an umbrella for his Japanese superiors. This was deemed as evidence that Yasuke was nothing more than a slave, a clownish slave at that, and that the Japanese at the time didn't take him seriously. Of course, this ignores the fact that the picture actually depicts the Portuguese. You can tell from their clothing. They're very clearly Portuguese. You can tell from the frills and all that. And that there's no indication that this black person in this painting is Yasuke or anyone like that. It's never named. And also, it wasn't contemporary. It wasn't made during Sasuke's lifetime or during that previous period of time. It was made during the Tokugawa shogunate in the 17th century. It's after the Sengoku period. Strange that a lot of these pseudo-historians couldn't recognize a Portuguese merchant from a Japanese daimyo, but what are you going to do? I don't know. These people would post a photograph taken of a samurai and his retainer, trying to say that Yasuke wasn't a samurai, he was a slave. Look, right there, this photo of this retainer and his samurai and his retainer. Look at that kid carrying a sword. That ignores the fact that the photograph was taking place when photographs existed, which is centuries after the Sengoku period, and it was taken of a servant, not a retainer. The kid in the photo doesn't hold a rank, doesn't have a household, doesn't get a salary. It's not a retainer in this sense of the word. Most of the historical experts seem to only acknowledge a couple accounts of Yasuke, while ignoring all the historical documents to contradict their perspectives. It ignored many documents they didn't have access to because they were just getting what they could find online quickly and not, going to a library, looking at transcriptions of documents that are more detailed. They took the first few signs they could find, assumed this was all there was, and ignored historical documents, historical statements, museum-curated lists in order to justify, oh, hey, it's only like 2 or 3 mentions of Yasuke ever. He's barely even a figure. Also, this ignores that historical documents, famously, don't last. A piece of paper rots. So historians have to draw from secondary sources sometimes because the primary sources sometimes physically don't last. And again, all of this contradicts Japanese historians who said Yasuke was a samurai.
Kazuma Hashimoto, a Japanese consultant and translator in the video game industry, said the reception of Assassin's Creed Shadows was mostly positive in Japan. It was people in the West who were upset with seeing Yasuke as a samurai, he said, explaining that many of the negative online comments written in Japanese appeared to have been roughly translated from English. Yu Hirayama, a historian at the Japan University of Health Sciences who specializes in the Sengoku period, said that Yasuke's samurai status was not in question. There are very few historical documents about him, but there's no doubt that he was a samurai who served Nobunaga, Hirayama wrote on social media.
Because these experts online, you have a big enough platform, you can talk louder than the museums, louder than the students of history, and drown out any dissenting opinions. Also, the idea that Yasuke was the only character playable in Assassin's Creed Shadows is wrong. There's a shinobi who also is playable, and they just completely ignored her to say that Yasuke was the only playable character and that you couldn't play a Japanese character in this Japanese game. So the fact of the matter is that you're saying a Japanese samurai who existed in Japan, historical records confirm it, the Japanese have celebrated his figure for centuries now, you're telling the Japanese their history is wrong and that they're wrong for believing it? And you're speaking for these people? So while researching for this video, I stumbled upon a video by a user named Cabrutus, where they went around Japan to interview Japanese people about the Assassin's Creed Shadows trailer. Now, clearly what this user wanted was to find the Japanese people just offended as they were. That, yeah, how dare they put Yasuke in the trailer? How dare they misrepresent the Sengoku period? But the average Japanese person that he talked to didn't seem to care.
の適切な表現だと、ちょっと、表すには適切だと思いますか？どう思いますか？
そこまで日本の文化にすごく詳しいというわけではないんですけれども、特にそんなに違和感はなかったと思います。はい。キャラクターの格好も十分適切だと思いますし、使ってる武器等もその火縄銃だったりしたので、特に変なところはなかったと思います。
Either they thought the trailer was just really cool and neat, or they thought it was a good representation of the historical era.
全然自分は確かに日本の侍ではあるんですけど、でも全然違和感ないというか、すごくいいと思いますよ。はい。
And you can tell Cabrutus didn't expect this answer because he starts getting more and more morose as the video goes on. At a certain point, he just turns to his camera person to ask him for his opinion, and it just seems like he expected something very different to happen and didn't get it.
It doesn't seem that anyone in Japan that I know at least knows about the series or the character Yasuke. Not the character, the historical figure.
So you think that would you think that when they look at the trailer, they think that it's just a fictional story, and that's it.
As though he expected Japan to be just as outraged as the experts online told him they would be. And yeah, I know the implication ultimately is them saying, a lot of Japanese people don't know about Yasuke, therefore he couldn't have been all that important, or maybe the game was exaggerating his importance. But this is like me walking up to some random on the street and saying, hey, buddy, you ever hear of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment from the Civil War that fought for the Union? What? You don't know about it? Well, that's strange. They made a goddamn movie about it. Maybe it wasn't important after all. See what I mean? You see the issue, right? You see the big problem with all this? They're trying to talk over the actual experts. They're trying to ignore historical record. They're trying to reframe documents, saying that these images made decades or centuries later, they're contemporaries of the Sengoku period, and that it proves my point. They had a thesis to begin with, and they used evidence that they manipulated to push their idea. Because the reality is, people who claim the historical pieces of work depicting people of color, depicting the gay community, depicting all that, saying that they are inaccurate. Well, inaccurate in what way? Are you saying that the treatment of them is inaccurate? Well, that's a discussion for the day. But are you saying that their existence is inaccuracy? Well, you don't know that. You don't know, for example, that Sicily had a large North African population because fishermen would regularly travel from the north of Africa into Sicily and settle there, maybe have children there. You wouldn't know that unless you look at the historical records, what have you. You wouldn't know about how Carthage, when they went through North Africa into Spain when invading Rome, brought with them a lot of Middle Eastern, a lot of North African people into Spain. This resulted in a lot of black people existing in medieval Europe because they were there for centuries, if not over 1,000 years, depending on when the story is being told. All of this leads to a more complicated, more nuanced viewpoint of history and historical population, trading patterns, travel patterns, what have you. And because of that, it's hard to really narrow it down to just saying, oh, hey, this one group of people couldn't have existed in this story because how could they? Well, if you look at history, you can see how. Then again, we are dealing with people who think that Japanese anime characters with names like Deku or Usagi or Motoko Kusanagi are white. And if you don't believe me...
Hell, even anime characters like Ash, Sailor Moon, Goku, Naruto, Ichigo, Luffy, Eren Yeager, Saitama, Deku, and just so many other anime characters look white.
Oh, I'm sorry. Look white. Not are white. My mistake. We almost made a terrible error here, didn't we? Like there's any meaningful difference between those two statements. We've looked so far at a lot of cases where diversity was definitely not forced in, but there's gotta be some cases of it, right? Some cases where objectively diversity should not have been put in where it was. Well, yeah, there are a couple cases. They are very rare and very unusual, but they do exist. And when they do happen, they can cause a lot of problems. Specifically, in regards to, ironically, considering what we were just talking about, historical accuracy. Undeniably, it goes without say that recasting the race of a real person is vastly different than recasting a fictional character. While on one hand, it's not a big deal if you, say, draw Kiki from Kiki's Delivery Service as a black girl, there's a vastly big difference if, say, you made a person who we know historically is one ethnicity and changed it. That can add a lot of uncomfortable implications. This is especially true when, certain people who want to look, push the boundaries of what's acceptable. Say, hey, what if we made a Martin Luther King movie with Ryan Gosling playing Martin Luther King? Wouldn't that be something? It's ridiculous. So we have to be fair with that. When it comes to real people, let's try to be accurate to who they were. Specifically, what a lot of people will argue when you say forced diversity doesn't exist, and the comment I got 1,000 times over when I announced I was going to do this project, was, what about African Queens? The Netflix documentary that had a single season focused on Cleopatra.
Queen Cleopatra is a documentary, not a movie. So as much as I hated the Woman King for being historically inaccurate, at the end of the day, it was a movie, not a documentary. This is a documentary, so it's far worse.
Categorized as a docudrama by Netflix, the Queen Cleopatra season of African Queens was produced and narrated by Jada Pinkett Smith. It was unanimously hated by audiences, and one of the big points of contention about the series was the casting for Cleopatra as a black woman. Now, at first glance, it might seem strange, saying that a black woman playing a queen from the continent of Africa, saying it's weird that it was black. Why would that be a problem? Well, yeah, I mean, you can always point at saying white people have traditionally played Cleopatra. Elizabeth Taylor, for example, is one of the most famous casting choices for Cleopatra. For centuries, when Cleopatra has appeared on stage, such as in Shakespeare with Cleopatra and Mark Antony, she's played by a white woman. Or a white man, if we're talking about the authentic productions of Shakespeare, as was performed in the day. So is this another Othello situation, where the wrong ethnicity has been cast consistently throughout history? Is that the case? And is this documentary trying to right the wrongs of productions past? Well, no, because Cleopatra wasn't of Egyptian birth. Cleopatra is of Hellenistic descent, Greek, because her family wasn't Egyptian. The Ptolemy family tree is quite frankly one of the most horrific family trees I've ever seen. The fact that Cleopatra didn't emerge like the final form from the movie The Substance is remarkable, considering just how backwards this family tree is. The Ptolemy line was placed in charge of Egypt by Alexander the Great. Ptolemy I was one of Alexander's most trusted companions, which, you know, you can read a few different ways knowing Alexander the Great. Cleopatra's first language was not Egyptian, it was Greek. In fact, it was noteworthy that she was the first ruler since Ptolemy I of Egypt to learn Egyptian. Yeah, most of the pharaohs under the Ptolemy line didn't even speak the language of their people. What does that tell you? But then again, Cleopatra also didn't look like Elizabeth Taylor. You know, she looked Greek, she looked Hellenistic. She looked, you know, not like Elizabeth Taylor, who's British, you know? In fact, we really don't know what Cleopatra really looked like, but suffice it to say, she probably did not look the way you and I think she did, or how she looks in popular culture when depicted. Coins minted around the time Cleopatra and Mark Antony were wed depicted Cleopatra as looking similar to Mark Antony. Now, it's uncertain if this was meant to be an accurate representation of Cleopatra's appearance, or if the coin printers had like one face mold and they didn't really change it. As we can see here, Cleopatra had more of a defined, larger nose, a sharper chin. You know, it's hard to tell if this was an accurate depiction of what she looked like or not, or if they just wanted her to look like Mark Antony, who had those features. This depiction from the 1st century BC, we see the goddess Venus here with a cupid. Historians believe the depiction of Venus in this image is based on Cleopatra. Now, I want to draw attention to a few things. Notice the fuller face, the fuller figure. Cleopatra is often pictured as this slender, lithe beauty in modern depictions, but in her day, Cleopatra was depicted as full-figured. Again, a far cry from almost every single casting choice we've seen in our modern era.
If I had to pick a white person to play Cleopatra, I would probably pick Scarlett Johansson. After all, she was described as very beautiful.
Beauty is not a consistent concept. It's not something that's stable from generation to generation. But I digress. What I'm trying to say is that, as far as I'm concerned, we have not had an accurate depiction of Cleopatra in any medium since film started. I think they've all been wrong. The idea to say that any depiction is more accurate is delusional, because none of them are Greek, and none of them are full-figured. But yeah, it's highly unlikely that Cleopatra looked dark-skinned. It's immensely unlikely. But that being said, to say that Elizabeth Taylor was more accurate is just as wrong. But is this someone forcing wokeness into the Cleopatra documentary? Or is this historical inaccuracy? Well, it's hard to say because it's kind of a mix of both, I guess I can say. Queen Cleopatra's director, who is not Jada Pinkett Smith, it's Tina Jaravi. She wrote a response to a lot of the criticism the documentary received upon its initial announcement, upon the early trailers, and in it she offers her reasoning as to why she cast a black actress in the role of Cleopatra. Now, she argued that the Ptolemaic lineage was 300 years removed from the Greek Ptolemy I. Now, the Ptolemy family did intermarry with the West Asian Seleucid dynasty. And well, okay, that did happen, but not really Cleopatra's family tree, which I repeat is a closed circle. It looks like the spirals from Uzumaki. That's how bad this family tree is. The director does confirm the decision to make Cleopatra black in this documentary was political. Undeniably so. It's overt. But the question is also this: how many people complaining about Cleopatra actually knew the history? I'm not saying some didn't, but the question remains, did people who got angry, did they know about this? Did they know about the family tree? Did they understand the history of the Ptolemy line? I'd wager no. And I think that's important because on one hand, there is a legitimate issue to be drawn here. There is a problem. There was an error made. One deliberately chosen, yes. It's historical inaccuracy and it's politicizing identity in a way that is concerning to historical accuracy. That is something worth discussing, and that is an issue with some depictions of historical figures. Early on, it was falsely reported that the Egyptian government itself was suing Netflix over this documentary, but the reality is a little different.
He even got sued on behalf of the entire country of Egypt. I didn't even know networks could get sued by countries.
It wasn't the Egyptian government, it was an Egyptian lawyer. One that argued that the very trailer for Queen Cleopatra, quote-unquote, distorted Egyptian identity. At no point does it say that it's inaccurate. Simply a distortion of Egyptian identity, and very specifically, contradicts Islamic and societal values and principles from Egypt. Noticeably, the faith of Islam did not exist in the days of Queen Cleopatra. But at the same time, it's undeniable that most people complaining didn't really care about historical inaccuracy, because what they wanted was something that did not look like actual Cleopatra. They wanted Elizabeth Taylor, they wanted that visual. Maybe not Elizabeth Taylor specifically, but the idea that she represents of a very white woman in charge of Egypt. And while she was a white woman, they didn't really want the specific kind of white woman. You know, their version of Cleopatra is very idealized. And undeniably, historically, a lot of Egypt has been whitewashed. You know, that's just a fact. Am I defending the documentary? No. God, no. It's inaccurate. It's made a lot of errors, and people hate it for many good reasons. Clearly, being accurate to the history of Cleopatra was not a concern for them. That just wasn't a priority, and that deserves to be criticized. But I do find it strange how this documentary became a lightning rod for this discussion, as proof that Hollywood was trying to force diversity in everything, because one documentary chose to be very, very inaccurate with its depiction of a very famous historical figure, and the reasoning for it was very tenuous at best. So I grant you that. That isn't a case of someone trying to change the historical narrative to present a political idea, but if that's the one example you can find, a bad documentary, I don't know how to tell you, one that was run not by historians but by filmmakers, I don't know what to tell you. That's not the strongest evidence that this forced diversity thing is a real concern anyone should take seriously. One example a trend does not make. But even so, why should we care about this forced diversity thing? So what if a documentary like Cleopatra exists? What does that change? Does it harm anyone? Well, some people would argue that forced diversity is a form of replacement. The replacement theory is the idea that white people in America are being replaced by minorities, often Latino, often black, what have you.
It's not really a surprise that the guy who live streamed himself shooting people last week in Buffalo believed some racist bullshit. But that racism was dressed up in something called the Great Replacement Theory. It's the same theory these guys were stomping around about.
Jews will not replace us!
This is, of course, a racist dog whistle. It's a conspiracy theory used constantly by hate groups throughout all of America. The idea that true Americans, in other words, white Americans, are being outbred, are being pushed out of the limelight. The horrifying ultimate result of this would be that minorities would treat white people the way white people treated minorities for all this time, and they can't handle that.
Many white supremacists in the US had already worked each other up about the idea of white genocide when this theory came along.
That's a conspiracy theory, and it's used to recruit lots of people who are afraid of being obsolescent in society. Remember that clip we played at the start of the video? Here, let me replay that again for you.
And coming back to why it seems as though the studios are blatantly disrespecting the idea of female characters and ethnic minorities is because they overshadow original established characters just to place someone who fits those boxes in that role.
This clip is an example of replacement theory. It's ultimately arguing that by creating new characters who are diverse and different, they're pushing the limelight away from established characters. In other words, replacing them. This is ultimately pretty ridiculous. In general, new characters tend to become the center of attention in a franchise. And since we've already told many of these characters' stories in total, it's kind of, yeah, obviously, established characters take a sideline to the new characters established because we have to establish new characters. The fact that the characters are appearing at all is a big deal. Citing Terminator Dark Fate specifically as an example of forced diversity is very bizarre to me, considering that ever since Terminator 2, most of these films, most of these sequels, most of these follow-ups have established new characters, or new versions of old characters, that they'd have to re-establish. Terminator Salvation has far more original characters taking the spotlight than Terminator Dark Fate, yet you don't see the same complaint applying to Terminator Salvation, just Dark Fate. And likewise, the Sarah Connor Chronicles introduced several new characters, all of which took the spotlight away from Sarah Connor. Yet, no one said this either about that show. It's almost as if introducing new stories and new characters to add new blood to an aging franchise is just, in general, good practice to keeping a story alive longer. But if you point the finger at diversity as the key problem, then, well, you're just misinterpreting what the franchise has been doing this entire time, or perhaps just noticing it for the first time because the new character isn't a white male, which, again, for Terminator is pretty bizarre, considering Sarah Connor was one of the first really major female leads in a mainstream science fiction movie. But also, let's take a look at the rest of that clip to see where she was going with that idea.
For many viewers, it can feel as if established stories are being appropriated and merely replacing the male lead with a female one, instead of making a new story that is tailored to the female lead, allowing her to make her own mark. This approach of seeming to just be role-playing an already established character can come across as lacking authenticity and depth. Another example is Doctor Who.
Okay, hang on, let's take a look at what she just said. So she said that if you introduce a new character who's diverse, and it overshadows the established characters, that implies it's bad. So, or that people are being replaced, they're saying. Again, that's a key thing, the replacement. Keep in mind with Richard Meyer, he said the same thing. That Marvel was replacing characters like Spider-Man and the established cores of their universes with diverse replacements. But the reality is, let's look at the clips that she used. She used Little Mermaid, right? She used Terminator. She used... What is this? This is... Okay, here's what gets really funny. She's using the Midnight Suns game, the Marvel Midnight Suns, right? I'm pretty sure that's your character you can design. That's your customized character. The character only looks like how you choose them to look like. Unless you're saying Venom as a demon who's still Eddie Brock is diverse, which good luck there. Then you have, again, your custom character. Then you have Miles Morales.
Of seeming to just be role-playing.
Okay, you have Invincible, which again, okay, whatever, it's Invincible. There's not really anything changed here.
Already established character can come.
And now you have freaking Spider-Verse, one of the most popular movies for Spider-Man ever. And I'm guessing the implication is that Miles Morales replaced Peter Parker. But she's not saying that. She's just showing you an image to suggest that, and that's the key difference. She's not explicitly saying Miles Morales is a replacement for Peter Parker, but she's showing it while discussing how minority diverse characters replace established characters. That's how they get around explicitly making a point that is unpopular with the general populace to prove their idea. They suggest that this thing you recognize is bad. But they don't say it. They didn't say that. What are you talking about? She never said anything about Miles Morales. She just showed Miles Morales' face and showed Steven Universe characters on screen as a replacement of established IP, even though Steven Universe is an original IP that was diverse to begin with, and thus an example of what she's actually talking about in practice. It's almost like her point makes no sense, doesn't it? But let's take out that for a second. Because beyond replacement theory, which is a theory that's been heavily criticized by much smarter people than myself, there's also the idea that this diversity will somehow teach bad ideas. It'll implant bad thoughts into the minds of kids or young adults or people to normalize identities that certain people see as immoral. And this takes multiple forms beyond simply, because obviously a cartoon can't genetically produce people of color. People of color don't like produce by like a kid watching Steven Universe and seeing Garnet show up or something like that. No. But what they are afraid of with shows like Steven Universe is that the kids might become gayer having watched it.
I've dated women who have children. I have dated women who had children who are young, under the age of 13, and they constantly see on YouTube, social media, movies, television show, Disney now, where characters are gay, lesbian, queer, transsexual, and all this, and it makes them question things that they don't even know yet. They're not even able to quantify in their brains what these things mean. I dated someone, I'm not going to mention any names, who had a young son, and the son wasn't even 13, and he thinks he's gay.
One fear that you often see is that characters who are established as straight are being converted into being gay or bi or trans, and that simply isn't really happening as much as people think it is. In comic books, you often see right-wingers, especially in groups like Comicsgate, as mentioned before, who will harp on certain characters being turned gay. Tim Drake is a good example. Iceman is a better one. But you look at this and you go, okay, you can name 5 characters who've been turned gay. There are others too, but you really harp on a couple specific ones. And it's such a big widespread problem that you keep harping on the same few characters. The argument always becomes, why don't you make your own characters? Instead of forcing characters to be gay, make your own characters who are gay. And well, they'll do that. You'll see that with John Kent. You have a character who was created, first relationship he has is with another man. And the same rhetoric comes in that they're forcing gayness and biness into our medium.
So Ethan Van Sciver was right. DC Comics made John Kent, son of Superman and Lois, a phallic unicorn.
Which is ridiculous. Undeniably so. A big common thing I've seen with Iceman specifically is that Jean Grey... Okay, so context for this. In the X-Men at some point, the original X-Men team is time-traveled and brought into the present of the 616 universe. So you have teen Jean Grey, teen Bobby Drake, etc. At some point, Jean Grey reads Bobby Drake's mind and realizes Bobby Drake is a repressed homosexual. And upon realizing this, they confront the older adult Bobby Drake from the main timeline, and it turns out, yeah, he's a repressed homosexual, and that this is something he's been hiding this whole time. So for decades of comic book continuity, Bobby Drake has been secretly gay. Okay, that's a storyline. People got angry, though, and said, well, that doesn't make sense. There's so and so many times he's been with a woman, etc., ignoring the fact that people can be repressed and hide their sexuality for years. Now, one theory I've seen a lot of people spread that I think is overtly wrong is the idea that Bobby Drake was brainwashed into being gay by Jean Grey.
Now, a couple things happened. Number one, she outed him. This is in a Brian Michael Bendis story where she's like, Bobby, you're gay. But then she did like a hand to her temples thing. So there's a fan theory that she literally turned him gay with her psi powers. So, Brian Michael Bendis had to virtue signal. So it's like, I want Bobby to be gay, but I'm not sure how to. Then he just types, Jean Grey says, Bobby, you're gay.
So that Jean Grey used the gay missile on his head and turned him gay. Who knows? Now, the problem with that theory is this. The way time travel works in Marvel, the Bobby Drake who was displaced from time becomes a variant in time. So it's an alternate reality version. It's actually, if you look in the Marvel comics, there's a whole universe designation for that version of Bobby Drake that's separate from 616. If Bobby Drake was turned gay for some reason, it would not affect the 616 timeline because they are two different entities. Time travel's weird in Marvel. Just if you displace from time, you're now an alternate branching path. You get the idea. So logically, nothing that happened to Bobby Drake should affect adult Bobby Drake at the time. Even though, yes, I do know later on that Kid Bobby Drake was reinserted back into time along with the other young X-Men so that they could kind of reemerge in the timeline as if nothing's been interrupted. But again, in that case, they had no memories of what happened anyway. So if they really were affecting each other, then young Bobby Drake would not be gay because anything that happened in the timeline when they were displaced was erased from their mind. Therefore, Bobby Drake as an adult, if your logic still held true, would no longer be gay because the events that happened to young Bobby Drake would be erased. That is simply not what happened, and you're wrong if you think that. Just objectively. Jean Grey did not make Bobby Drake gay. Didn't happen. Character was just retconned to be gay. And that retcon opened the door up to different stories. Now again, people will then say, well, you made Bobby Drake a gay stereotype. Well, no. If Sina Grace's account is anything to go by, Marvel actually kept them from making Bobby Drake more overtly queer when they wrote Bobby Drake's Iceman solo series. The idea that comics are being forced to be gayer, not a reality. The fear, though, is that you're indoctrinating people with this queer media, and that's going to make more people gay, I guess.
And studies show that kids that experience trauma and stuff, it affects them later on. So if they're growing up and they're seeing, lesbians and gays on Disney Plus, they're already conditioning themselves that, hey, I want to suck dick.
Again, tying back into replacement theory, the idea that this media is somehow, like the metaphorical Jean Grey gay bomb, making the audience gayer as a result in some way, which is ridiculous. It's purely silly because people do not choose to be gay, they don't choose to be bi, they don't choose to be trans. They are born that way, and society suppresses their instinct to be that. It suppresses the desire to express oneself, even to themselves. There's a famous chart that depicts left-handedness and how many people identified as left-handed. The moment people stopped, trying to train people to not be left-handed, people who identified as left-handed jumped and skyrocketed in number before hitting a plateau. Now, that's not to say that people suddenly started choosing to use their left hands more. It's that the plateau was the level it was always at, and all the people who didn't identify as left-handed before were left-handed people who were being forced, either by society or by some external force, to not use their left hand, to train themselves to be right-handed. The same thing applies to LGBTQA stuff. It's not that media is making people more gay. It's that the people who you think are being made gay by media were always gay, and you were just trying to teach them to not be gay. Ironically, you are accusing the media of doing the exact opposite of what's actually happening. And frankly, there are so few actually meaningful characters who are LGBTQIA in media right now that's ridiculous. And many of the ones who are queer are being suppressed from media. Just recently, Disney kept an episode of the show Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur from airing because it depicted a trans character. This episode was leaked. It's a fine episode, but Disney felt, given the current political climate, that it would be improper to debut this episode, which again is very fitting. Alex Hirsch, the creator of Gravity Falls, told people how it was back in the day. Disney will put up these big, we love the LGBTQA community on public media, but behind the doors will tell creators to stop putting gay stuff in, stop putting gay stuff in, stop putting gay stuff in. The media is not adding queer media, it's repressing queer media from fully expressing itself fully. They are not forcing diversity in. They are keeping diversity out. They commodify differences of orientation and identity in order to be more marketable, at least perceived as more marketable, without going too far. Again, this is kind of why they tried to market the first gay character, but each first gay character for Disney was basically a glorified cameo at best and implication at worst. This is an element that's very important with understanding how media is marketed towards these groups. Rainbow capitalism is a term that exists because capitalists want to market to the LGBTQA community without having to worry about fully diving into queer ideas and queer representation in a way that's meaningful and impactful for audiences. They sanitize it, but that sanitized version scares people enough to have a reaction.
The 6ABC data team analyzed book bans across the country and found Pennsylvania is in the top 3 states for banning books.
That's frightening to me.
Mindy Freeman and her daughter worry about how the ban will impact other kids.
When the school board and administration takes that away from students, it's actively harming them and it's actively not making them feel safe in school.
The books that are banned on a yearly basis most of them nowadays represent LGBTQA themes. Heartstoppers was challenged in libraries, taken off library shelves because they were perceived to be pornographic. Heartstoppers, a book where, at best you get scandalous hand-holding, It's ridiculous. It's downright ridiculous that we act as though this is somehow dangerous media for youths and all that, when what we're seeing is basically something very, very fine and very, very wholesome. If this was between a man and a woman, you wouldn't even pass a second glance at it. But it's not. Therefore, it's deemed as overtly sexual. A queer relationship is often depicted by word of mouth as pornographic when it's the same stuff you'd see with a straight couple. But queer identity is not the only thing where people have hand-wringing and try to beg, think of the children, you can't put this in media, it's going to harm people. Body diversity is another thing that's also depicted as a dangerous lifestyle choice that the media is educating and indoctrinating people with. And that's very dangerous too. Now, one element of character design that's very important is that you really want to have varied character design. You want to have, if you put the characters in silhouettes, they'd all be identifiable by their silhouettes and be distinct and all look different. When She-Ra was first being remade, one of the big things that people got upset by was the differences in character design. Every character was redesigned. Now, in the previous She-Ra show from the 80s, the characters all had a very similar character design. I would say cut and paste in some ways, but I'm not being very charitable to the kind of cookie-cutter design the characters used to have. But you saw in the remake, they did diversify the body types, the racial diversity, all that. They tried to make them more distinct so that if you lined up all the princesses and all the side characters, they all looked distinct. And they succeeded. And a lot of people, for some reason, were angry by trying to spice up the cast a little bit. I guess because they didn't all look like supermodels. Who knows? Of course, the character Bo was one of the many listed up as a victim of the ginger side in media, where gingers were replaced, but that's just ridiculous. Strange no one cares when Matt Murdock, a redhead character, was cast with a brown-haired actor. I'm sure it's total coincidence that that's just a white person cast as... I'm sure it's nothing. I think it's a big deal. But anyway, the accusations of ginger side aside, a lot of people were angry when Spinnerella was redesigned for the She-Ra series, mainly because she was given wider hips and soft, fuller features. The ire of the internet was there for some time against her. The fandom kind of overshadowed this problem when people actually saw the show and liked it, but it's undeniable that the initial reaction that Spinnerella got among certain groups was ire, was anger. And for what? Because her character looked different. Ignoring when shows have body diversity as a gag or whatever the going on with Totally Spies at any given moment, body diversity is almost universally criticized by a certain subset of the audience, mainly because it apparently tries to encourage the audience to forego physical fitness? What? Because clearly, having a different body type is somehow reflective of some moral failing. This all falls back on a lot of fat-phobic ideas. And if your movie isn't depicting obesity at the same way The Whale depicts obesity, in that it is dehumanizing and disturbing and just awful in every sense of the word, then the movie's doing a failing and not making you feel guilty for existing and taking up space. The idea, of course, is that abdominal muscles are presented as a sign of physical strength, that if you have abs and biceps, that's a good thing, but this ignores the fact that Hugh Jackman had to dehydrate his body so his abs could be visible in the Wolverine. This ignores the fact that the only thing that allows you to have abs isn't how big your muscles are, but how reduced your body fat is. And quite frankly, in some cases, to reduce your body fat to show abs that visibly that we glorify as the peak of fitness, you'd have to actually dehydrate your body and deprive yourself of nutrition for long stretches of time. It's not sustainable. If you look at the body of Olympic athletes, you realize that their body types are diverse. You're not going to say an Olympic athlete's out of shape or encouraging an unhealthy lifestyle, are you? Well, why would you do it with anyone else? But this is worse when talking about the body of children, who are judged and scrutinized by people online in a way that I personally find repulsive. Take April O'Neil. April O'Neil's been through a few different changes over the years. In the comics, she's arguably a black woman. From a lot of the cartoons from the 80s and 2000s, she's a white redhead. Recent cartoons depicted her as black. But when you get to the most recent TMNT movie, a lot of people started throwing fits over how she was apparently depicted as overweight and black. And you saw a lot of people have very concerned messages about fitness in response to this.
Making April go from a physically fit and daring woman to an overweight one is a disservice to her character, and it pushes a message that being overweight is okay, when we should be
Here's a question for you. Daring physical fit woman, an overweight woman. The conflict is right there. You're not saying that you think that an overweight woman isn't daring or sophisticated or good. You're implying it, though, by leaving out certain adjectives of a complementary nature with the second example.
Pushing healthy habits instead of making excuses for laziness and complacency. They could.
Oh my god. Again, he's making all these connections between body type and personality type. You know nothing about this character. At all. This is ridiculous.
Have easily made April a fit and daring black woman, and people would have been much more receptive to it.
Ah, much more receptive. Not completely receptive. Because you also know that when that happened, people also complained about it being quote-unquote woke, or whatever the buzzword was at that time. You realize that more receptive doesn't mean they would be receptive. It means they'd find a different component to complain about. Which they did back then, by the way.
Not to mention that April at times helps the turtles fight, and she follows them into danger when it comes to chasing her news stories. This new version looks like she'd be out of breath opening a fridge, and it feels like a deliberate character assassination by the creators.
She's not that overweight, man. Like, she looks slightly heavy. They can still fight. You know? Like, this is... What do you... You'd think she was like 500 pounds, the way they're talking about her. Like, what are you talking about? That is not a way you can talk about any person, quite frankly. And that speaks more about your own insecurities than anything else. She's a child. She is literally a kid. And you're acting like she's going to have a heart attack based on purely her appearance. That is... But he's not fat phobic, guys. He's totally not being bigoted right now about it. Like, she's just looks like an average teenager. It's ridiculous.
I understand why these things are happening, and it's because creators want their female characters to be seen as unremarkable and attainable. But as someone who works out a lot, I think normalizing and worshipping the concept of being overweight is not a good thing for either.
Worshipping the... What are you talking about? A character design isn't worshipping anything. It just exists. What the fuck are you talking about, man? What in God's name are you on? Worshipping? A person existing doesn't mean you're worshipping that. It means the character just exists. Oh my god. This character's a child, alright? Why are so many adult men being so uncomfortable about the body of a child? That to me strikes me as very disturbing, because you're scrutinizing a kid. Kids just look like that. That's just how people are, you know? Like, it's really weird. Am I the only one that finds this kind of creepy, actually? Like, a little bit? This is really strange behavior to be saying. This is something that you wouldn't say to a person in real life. Why would you make these statements about a fictional character, knowing that people who do look like this might hear you and reflect upon themselves in a way that's negative and self-deprecating? Why would you tell someone that they're living an unhealthy lifestyle if you don't know what their lifestyle is? And how do I know someone who's making videos online isn't more unhealthy? As we see with Olympic athletes, their body types sometimes do just look like that. Doesn't it seem strange to you that we're just accepting this? That we're just putting this out there in the world? That we're acting as passing moral judgment on the media we consume as though it somehow is reflective of the choices we make in real life? When in actuality, you don't know enough people who look like that to make an ethical judgment on what they do with their lives, how they live their lives. You don't know these people. So how can you give accurate understanding of their medical information when you know nothing about them? And granted, we're talking about characters, yes, but the comments for these fictional characters are reflected and reflect the behaviors and actions of real people. This whole thing strikes me as very perverse in a way that I find kind of disturbing. But again, we're falling back on something here. A few video essayists and commentary channels online, that's not reflective of great trends. But there is an argument to be made, one that is valid about all this forced diversity that we've been alluding to and discussing this whole time. The way capitalism influences the decisions of these businesses. Companies aren't doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. They're doing it to make money. AIP did not make Blaxploitation films because they cared about black audiences. Disney didn't have their first gay character in their movie because they really cared about LGBTQA representation. I'd hope that my explanations of these themes so far have made that apparent. No, they did it to make money. Case in point, the infamous Blizzard chart. When Blizzard was making Overwatch, a chart leaked online, an internal document designed to measure the value of various characters based on arbitrary diversity points. How many points would a gay character be? How many points would a Latino character be? How many points would a fat character be? A buff character, a black character, a South Indian character, a Chinese character. And they would use this to measure how diverse the characters were in order to assure that the game would appeal to every demographic on an international level. It was done to judge and gauge interest in the various characters, to measure their value to the game's ultimate propositional worth to audiences. Forced diversity doesn't exist. What does exist is cynical marketing. What does exist are companies that try to market you based on you looking like the character. Representation does matter, and artists understand that. And while an artist might work within the company's system to create meaningful art, at the end of the day, the company will take that and use it as an asset to make money. And when they stop thinking that will make them any money, they hide it. Look at Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur. Disney signed off on an episode. They signed off on it being made. They read the script. They saw the storyboards. They say, go forward with it. And then the moment that the political climate started to shift slightly, they backed away. Because it was never about actually making diverse media. It was only about appealing to a demographic. And they judged the demographic the show would appeal to was less valuable than any arbitrary response to it. So they hid like cowards. And likewise, Blizzard pushed an agenda. Not a political agenda, but a marketing agenda. And that's what it comes down to. That's what it's always been about. How much money can the company take from your pockets by giving you table scraps? By taking the hard work of artists and putting them on this chart? Or rather, offering artists a chance, cynically, to make the thing that they want to make. You know, telling artists, you can make your character, you can make your superhero, you can make your all these things, and then just calculating, market valuing, studying, and equating putting a number to your art, to your creative genius. That's what it is. And how much money can you milk from it? Companies do this all the time. Again, Rebecca Sugar, Steven Universe. I mentioned it before. Rebecca Sugar was given an offer. You can either have several more seasons of your show, which is a hit and people love, or you can have this wedding scene you want to make with Ruby and Sapphire, one of the first queer weddings in animation history. Rebecca Sugar chose the wedding. That was forced diversity, because she was forcing art through the company system. Same with N.D. Stevenson.
The creator of the reboot She-Ra and the Princesses of Power on Netflix had to resort to subterfuge on their own series in order to achieve the romantic ending between two of the main characters. My big fear was that I would show my hand too early and get told very definitively that I was not allowed to do this. I sort of had a plan, and it was like, if I can get them to this place where their relationship and that romance is central to the plot, and it can't be removed, can't be noted out, or it can't be something that's cut later, then they'll have to let me do it. Stevenson said she worked to plant seeds over the course of several seasons, weaving different threads that intertwined Adora and Catra's storylines to the point where it couldn't be anything else but romantic love. Once everything was in place and the crew had been informed, Stevenson told the executives her plan to end the series with Catra and Adora confirming their mutual feelings. The fight for positive LGBT representation is a constant, ongoing uphill battle.
By manipulating the story in a certain way, The only way the story could end was if She-Ra and Catra confessed their love. He did it very carefully. And in doing so, N.D. Stevenson made a very good sapphic series. But these exist only because artists and creatives forced their vision through the company system, through a cynical system that they knew would stop them and impede them if they made their ideas overt in the beginning. That is admirable. That is fighting the system to create art that is meaningful to you, that is meaningful to the audience that loves it and cares about it. And yes, those are kids' stories. Yeah, they're kids' cartoons from a few years ago. But just because it was a few years ago does not mean it changed anything. The systems in place that kept those creatives from making their art are still in place. If anything, they've gotten more savvy to making it not happen again. And it's very depressing. It's deeply disappointing to see this happen constantly again and again and again. Take a look at the show Velma, for example. Velma marketed itself as basically forced diversity, a very cynical marketing attempt to draw controversy. Even in their marketing promotion, as you see with this initial trailer for the show, they knew full well that they were trying to capitalize on online controversy to market the series.
If there is one thing the internet agrees on, it's that you should never change anything ever. I hope you die. Sincerely, Velma. Well, at least Judy's still white.
And the end result is a show that makes fun of a lot of South Asian people. It uses a lot of jokes at the expense of racial minorities. This show isn't woke. It's a purely cynical marketing attempt using this controversy to drum up interest in the series. And people took the line and went with it. And it's so depressing to watch people act like this is somehow a positive thing, that they wanted this, that they were trying to be woke or something. No, it was marketing. It always is marketing. That's why stuff like Crunchyroll's High Guardian Spice struggled so much. It was marketed as a queer series, and all the marketing didn't show the series with its plot, its stories, its characters. It showcased a lot of people who were very passionate about what they were doing, and the company, Crunchyroll, put them front and center to the internet mob. They used them as a shield to deflect any criticism of them as a company. It wasn't the company, it was these creatives trying to worm their way into this artistic medium, putting the agenda before story. Well, that has nothing to do with the show. All shows have that mentality behind the scenes, where people go, okay, how can we make this show unique? How can we make it different? Was the show good? No, I can't stand High Guardian Spice. I think it's crap. But that's not the point. The point is how the company marketed the show.
We are 50% female in all the creative roles, and our writer's room is 100% female. I mean, this is what my whole career has been about, is trying to get those voices in there that are not being heard.
That marketing campaign did High Guardian Spice no favors. Before you saw a single bit of animation, of anything that you usually see first with a debut or promotional material, you were geared to be frustrated with the film because it felt like it was an agenda first and a story second. That was the idea. That was the deliberate design by the marketing department. You were engineered to get angry at this show. And that's really depressing. And again, who was put front and center? The creatives, who were given a job to do, who were hired by the company, and that was it. And from there was a name and a face for people to target. How dare these people try to make a story that they thought was interesting, to make the narrative they wanted to see in the world? The show was never given a chance to succeed because the marketing department screwed it before it could even get started. And yeah, the show sucked. But you know what? I'd rather think it sucked on the merits of its story than feel compelled to defend it because the marketing team fucked up. And what ultimately happens is companies get to watch you fight and argue and offer free promotion for their show. And all that comes back to their pockets. They line their pockets with your controversy. They love it when you get angry. Ubisoft loves seeing you get angry about Assassin's Creed Shadows. Disney loves it when you get angry about their media because it stirs up interest. And yeah, they have their committees that they want to have to avoid fan backlash. But don't get me wrong, they love it when you fight. They love it because you do more promotion for their media and their stuff than they could ever do it for themselves. It's free word of mouth. Everyone's talking about it. They get the conversation rolling. People tuned in to Velma just to get angry at it, and the show coasted on your rage. It's kind of repulsive, honestly. So what can we learn from this? The cycle of content requires fresh blood. Backlash starts at the trailer stage. if not casting stage. The Acolyte, for example. It got hate when it first was announced. The moment Amanda Stenberg was cast, people were already making jokes. They were sharpening the pitchforks. Didn't even matter when the show came out. They were getting angry at posters. There were multiple videos with millions of views in response to the trailer. The same thing that happened with the Ghostbusters film. Was The Acolyte a great show? No, it was not. It was fine at best. We don't really know what to do with fine, though. So anger prevailed. It had problems? Of course it did. What show doesn't? Was it flawed? Absolutely. Did it have a few good moments? Yeah, it did. Would I have really wanted to see a second season? Yeah, to see where it went. Some shows get better in season 2. That's a factor. It's a truth. Iron out the kinks when you first get started. I mean, Star Trek Next Gen, first season's kind of went lame. It goes on from there, it's much better. But the show was canceled. But that's not the problem. The problem isn't that the Acolyte was diverse or whatever. The problem was it was set up to fail from the beginning because people wanted it to fail. The moment that a few things fall into place, it's their target of ire. And even when other things are obviously wrong with it, diversity is always blamed. The Acolyte had many problems. Diversity wasn't one of them. Weak writing, sure. Bad sets, a massive budget. Yeah, all those are factors. Weird acting choices, yeah, 100%. Diversity was not the problem. There was a game that came out called Concord. It was taken off stores days after coming out. And the big narrative among certain YouTubers was that it was a woke game and that it was doing the DEI agenda and it was diverse. And the problem was it was so diverse, gamers were being lost. Well, no. The problem wasn't diversity. The problem was that all the characters looked the f***ing same. Look at these character designs. These are terrible. The colors are all crappy. None of these characters look distinct. Compare the characters from Concord to games like Team Fortress 2, to Overwatch. Hell, compare it to games like Darkstalkers or Skullgirls. Games where every character looks distinct. You see these characters, you know exactly what they're about, you know their personality, you know it all. Concord, they all look bland and boring and corporate. They look like a corporate lineup that a marketing team went with all the diversity points in their chart and went, okay, how do we make the safest diverse cast possible? And they went with it. Marketing geared the creation of that game. And I'm sure there were tons of artists and creatives who had brilliant ideas for that game, and I'm positive their ideas were ironed down, filed down, pushed down, nailed down, and the nail that stuck out slightly more than the rest was hammered until it stuck right down. And yeah, it looks diverse, but that's marketing for you. These characters aren't diverse. They're all the same. I can't tell you anything about anyone by first glance. Diversity is ultimately about highlighting the differences as well as the similarities. It's about creating contrast between people. And by creating contrast, everyone stands out more in a way that's positive. Go back to the 90s. That era people keep harkening back to, saying things were better in the past. Well, look at Captain Planet, Hey Arnold, Power Rangers. Yeah, there's some problems. The fact that the Yellow Ranger was Asian and the Black Ranger was black. Kind of a little on the nose there, buddy, but hey, every character stood out. When you saw them, you knew exactly what they were about. All of them. And yeah, surely Captain Planet, it does kind of suck. It's hokey. It's cheesy. But hey, it did everything that you're complaining about these shows today did, and no one complained back then. Same concept, except a little more political because the show was overt political tracks about the environment. They had a whole racism episode. The problem isn't diversity. The problem is marketing. Corporatization, rainbow capitalism, safe diversity that a company can capitalize on. It's turning identity into a corporate commodity, into a corporate product. And the problem is, people are part of that marketing branch, whether they realize it or not. When you make 15 YouTube videos about it, you are doing marketing for that entity. There's a reason why Ghostbusters 2016 grossed more, not profited more, but grossed in the box office more than Ghostbusters Afterlife. And Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, for that matter, as well. Because people were talking about it. There was a discussion. Yeah, it was a flawed discussion, but it was still a discussion. And it was more of a discussion than the later stuff did, which I think is better. I think it's better. But listen, what it comes down to is this. The reason why this debate is so important to me personally is that when we have this debate, what we're ultimately doing is debating the value of people's identity, whether or not we want people to exist visibly in our art and our medium. People say, oh, well, we don't complain about good diversity. Well, how do you know what good diversity is? You complain about trailers. You haven't even seen the media yet. You haven't played the game yet. How do you know it's any good? You don't know what you're talking about. Yet. Wait for it to come out. then talk about it. Discuss it when it's out. Nowadays, reactions start with the trailers. Look at Prey, a movie that people now generally agree on as being one of the best Predator movies of all time. And the reaction upon its first initial release of its trailer was overtly negative. People were angry in certain circles. Most people saw that and thought, hey, Native Americans fighting predators? That sounds cool. But there was some groups that, oh, it's a woke DEI agenda, and they were eating their words when the movie came out, and they realized people liked it. And this is not unique. This is a trend where people online are jumping the gun at any chance they get to find the next Ghostbusters 2016, to find the next Acolyte, to find that next thing that can get their views into the millions and add profit by rage and getting angry about it. That's what forced diversity is. It's a means to market themselves as well as a means for companies to market their product. In the end, all of it is marketing lingo. And it's ridiculous. Because ultimately speaking, the fear at root here is that people don't want to see people unlike themselves, or disturbance in what they perceive to be the normalization of media in existence. Now look, listen, I live outside New York City. I live right outside there. I'm used to people who look different than myself, act different, believe in different things, different races, different orientations, different sizes, different disabilities, different genders, different religious backgrounds. And the world doesn't fall apart. I think a lot of people who don't live in diverse areas think somehow if you add diversity in, it's going to cause this cataclysm, that the dominoes are going to fall. But reality is simply this: you exist in a world where people are different from you all the time already. And the world didn't end. The problem is you now have to understand that your personal experience in life is not universal. And I think that scares some people. Too bad.